Hey guys, tonight we begin with you. Yes, you. Sitting there with your central heating, your antibiotics, and your absolutely unearned confidence that you could totally handle living in the past if you had to. You've seen the movies, you've played the video games, you've watched enough period dramas to think you understand what cold really means, what hunger actually feels like, what genuine fear of the dark entails. You don't. And tonight, we're going to walk through exactly why you, specifically you, would absolutely not survive in medieval times. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with something simple, something you do every single day without thinking about it: drinking water. In your world, water comes from a tap. You turn a handle, and clean, safe, drinkable water flows out. The infrastructure that makes this possible is invisible to you. You have no idea how the water gets there, what makes it clean, or what would happen if it stopped flowing. You just know it works. Always. Except in medieval times, water didn't work that way. Water was a full-time occupation, a daily gamble, and quite possibly the thing that would kill you fastest. See, medieval water sources came in basically three varieties. There was river water, which was essentially a flowing toilet because that's exactly what people used rivers for. There was well water, which might be clean or might be sharing space with a dead rat that fell in 3 weeks ago. And there was rainwater, which sounds romantic until you realise you're collecting it in a barrel that hasn't been cleaned since your grandfather's grandfather was alive. None of these options came with quality control. None of them came with filtration. You drank what you had and hoped your immune system was feeling ambitious that day. The medieval solution to unsafe water was beer. Not because medieval people were alcoholics, but because the brewing process killed most of the things in water that wanted to kill you. Which is medieval for whatever microscopic nightmares were lurking in your local water supply. So everyone drank beer, children drank beer, monks drank beer, nuns drank beer. Beer was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and hydration all rolled into one. And before you get excited about a society where beer is the default beverage, understand that medieval beer wasn't your craft IPA with notes of citrus and pine. It was weak, it was flat. It tasted like liquid bread, and it was consumed purely for survival. But let's say you figure out the water situation. Let's say you're clever enough to only drink beer, and you manage to avoid dysentery for a whole week. Congratulations. Now you have to deal with the cold. Modern people have no frame of reference for what cold actually means. You think you understand cold because you've been outside in winter. You've scraped ice off your windshield. You've worn a coat. But you've never been cold the way medieval people were cold. You've never been cold in a way that becomes a permanent state of existence, a baseline condition of life that you can't escape even in your own home. Medieval cold wasn't something you experienced when you went outside. It was something you lived with constantly, indoors and out, day and night, from November to March, with no relief and no hope of warmth. Medieval houses weren't insulated. The concept of insulation didn't exist. Walls were stone or wattle and daub, which is medieval for mud and sticks woven together and plastered over. Neither of these materials provided any meaningful barrier against the elements. The cold didn't gradually leak in. It marched in boldly, like it owned the place, because functionally it did. Windows, if you had them, were holes in the wall. No glass unless you were wealthy. Just shutters made of wood that you could close to keep out the wind. But closing them also meant living in complete darkness. So you chose between light and warmth, between seeing and not freezing, and there was no option that gave you both. Heat came from a fire in the centre of the room, not a fireplace, just a fire pit in the middle of the floor with smoke rising up to escape through a hole in the roof. This setup had several problems. First, smoke. Constant smoke filling your living space, stinging your eyes, coating your lungs, making everything you owned smell like a campfire. Second, inefficiency. Most of the heat went straight up through the roof hole along with the smoke. Third, fire hazard. You were essentially living in a wooden structure with an open flame in the middle. Fourth, the heat distribution was terrible. You could be roasting on the side facing the fire and freezing on the side facing away. There was no even warmth, no thermostat, no way to regulate temperature. You just huddled as close to the fire as you could without catching yourself on fire, which was a legitimate concern people had to actively manage. Nighttime was worse. The fire died down because you couldn't keep it burning at full strength all night. Fuel was expensive. Wood had to be gathered or purchased, and burning through wood too quickly meant you'd run out before winter ended, which meant death. So you let the fire die to embers, which meant the temperature inside your house dropped to approximately the same temperature as outside your house. You slept in your clothes. All of them. Every layer you owned went on your body at night. You shared a bed with your entire family, not for emotional closeness, but for thermal mass. Bodies generate heat. More bodies generate more heat. You needed that heat to survive the night. And medieval nights were long. Not just dark, but genuinely, astronomically longer in winter. The sun set at 4 in the afternoon. It didn't rise again until 8 in the morning. That's 16 hours of darkness, 16 hours of cold, 16 hours of nothing to do but lie in bed and wait for dawn because you couldn't afford to burn candles all night, and there was no light source besides fire anyway. You couldn't read because most people couldn't read, and also it was too dark. You couldn't work because you couldn't see. You just existed in the darkness, listening to the wind, feeling the cold, and hoping morning would come soon. Let's talk about what you'd be sleeping on. Not a mattress. Mattresses didn't exist in the form you know them. You'd be sleeping on a straw pallet, which is exactly what it sounds like. A fabric sack stuffed with straw, laid on a wooden bed frame if you were lucky, laid directly on the floor if you weren't. The straw would compress over time, losing any cushioning properties it might have had. It would also become home to fleas, lice, bed bugs, and whatever other insects enjoyed living in warm, dark places near human bodies, which was all of them. You couldn't wash the straw. You couldn't really clean the pallet. You just lived with it until the infestation became unbearable, at which point you'd throw it out and make a new one from fresh straw that would become infested again within weeks. The clothing you slept in was the same clothing you wore during the day. Medieval people didn't have separate pajamas. They barely had separate anything. Most people owned 2 outfits maximum, one to wear while the other was being washed. Washing happened infrequently because it was labour-intensive and hard on fabric. You'd wear the same tunic, the same hose, the same undershirt for days or weeks at a time. The smell was constant. Everyone smelled. All the time. You'd get used to your own smell and everyone else's smell because there was no alternative. Deodorant didn't exist. Regular bathing didn't exist for most people. You might bathe a few times a year if you were conscientious. Otherwise, you just accepted that human beings have a natural scent, and medieval life made that scent significantly more pungent. Now let's address the thing you probably think would be fine. Food. You're thinking you'd adapt to medieval food. You'd eat what they ate. How hard could it be? The answer is extremely hard because medieval food was designed to keep you alive, not to taste good, and the gap between those two objectives was massive. Your diet would be bread. Mostly bread. Almost entirely bread. Bread for breakfast, bread for lunch, bread for dinner. Dark, heavy, coarse bread made from whatever grain was available. Rye bread, barley bread, oat bread, wheat bread if you were wealthy. The bread would be dense enough to use as a weapon. You'd eat it with pottage, which is medieval for soup made from whatever vegetables you had lying, around boiled into submission. Cabbage, onions, leeks, beans, peas. The same ingredients every single day. No variety. No spices unless you were rich. No salt unless you were near a salt source. Just boiled vegetables and bread. Forever. Meat was rare. Unless you were nobility, you'd eat meat a few times a month if you were lucky. And the meat you'd get wouldn't be prime cuts. You'd get the parts of the animal that nobody else wanted. Offal. Organ meats. Gristly bits. Salted or smoked to preserve it, which made it incredibly salty and tough. You'd have to soak it in water before cooking just to make it chewable. Fresh meat was a luxury, a feast, something you'd remember for months. Vegetables were seasonal. You ate what grew in summer and fall. In winter, you ate preserved vegetables, which meant vegetables that had been salted, pickled or dried, salted cabbage, pickled onions, dried peas. Everything tasted like salt or vinegar or dust. There was no refrigeration, no way to keep things fresh. You preserved what you could and hoped it lasted until the next growing season. If it didn't, you starved. Fruit was even rarer than meat. Apples if you had an orchard. Berries if you had access to woods. That was about it. Citrus fruits didn't exist in medieval Europe. Bananas didn't exist. Pineapples didn't exist. Your fruit options were limited to whatever grew locally and whatever survived being preserved. Dried apples, preserved berries, maybe some pears if you were fortunate. Dairy came from whatever animals you could keep. Milk from cows or goats, consumed fresh or made into cheese because milk spoiled quickly. The cheese would be hard, salty and aged because that's how you made cheese last. Butter was rare and expensive. Most people used lard for cooking, which is medieval for pig fat. Everything was cooked in pig fat. Everything tasted like pig fat. You'd grow to either love pig fat or resign yourself to a lifetime of pig fat-flavoured meals. Sugar didn't exist for common people. Honey was the only sweetener, and honey was expensive. You'd have honey maybe once or twice a year. Maybe. The rest of the time, sweet meant nothing. Dessert wasn't a concept. After dinner, treats weren't a thing. You ate your bread and pottage and you were grateful you had food at all. And speaking of being grateful for food, let's discuss the very real possibility that you wouldn't have any. Famine was a regular occurrence. Bad harvest? Famine. Wet summer? Famine. Early frost? Famine. War passing through your region? Famine. Any disruption to the agricultural calendar meant potential starvation for thousands of people. You'd go hungry. Not hungry like you missed lunch. Hungry like you haven't eaten anything substantial in 3 days and you can feel your body starting to consume itself. Children died first in famines, then the elderly, then everyone else if it went on long enough. Famine was a fact of medieval life, appearing every few years with depressing regularity, and your modern body with its modern nutritional requirements and complete lack of famine adaptations would struggle immensely. Let's say you survive the water situation, the cold, the sleeping arrangements, and the food. You're doing great, you're beating the odds. Now you have to deal with disease, and this is probably where you die. Not from sword wounds or bandits or wolves, from disease. Specifically from diseases that don't exist anymore in the developed world because we've eradicated them or vaccinated against them, or developed treatments that make them manageable. You have none of those protections in medieval times. You're going in raw, with an immune system trained on hand sanitizer and antibiotics, facing pathogens that killed millions. The plague is the famous one, the Black Death, Yersinia pestis. It killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century. But the plague wasn't a one-time event. It came back, repeatedly. Every few decades there'd be another outbreak. You'd lose family members, neighbours, entire villages. The symptoms were horrific. Swollen lymph nodes the size of eggs, high fever, black patches on the skin where tissue died. Death in less than a week for most people. No treatment, no cure. You either survived or you didn't, and survival was mostly luck. But even without the plague, you had plenty of other diseases to contend with. Smallpox, measles, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, leprosy. Any of these could kill you. All of them were common. Smallpox left survivors scarred and often blind. Leprosy resulted in social exile and a slow death. Tuberculosis consumed you from the inside, making you waste away over months or years. Dysentery gave you bloody diarrhea until you died of dehydration. Typhoid gave you fever and delirium and organ failure. These weren't rare diseases that you might encounter. These were regular features of medieval life that everyone dealt with constantly. Injuries that are minor inconveniences today were potential death sentences then. Cut your hand on a farming tool, that could become infected. Infection could become sepsis. Sepsis could kill you. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of germ theory. People knew that cleaning wounds helped, but they didn't know why. They'd wash injuries with water or wine, which sometimes helped and sometimes made things worse depending on what was in the water or wine. Then they'd bandage it with cloth that hadn't been sterilised because sterilisation wasn't a concept yet. And they'd hope. Broken bones were another problem. A simple fracture could heal on its own if you were lucky, and if you managed to keep it immobilized. But if it healed wrong, you'd be crippled for life. If it was a compound fracture where the bone broke through the skin, you'd almost certainly die from infection. There was no surgery to fix it properly. No pins or plates to hold bones in place. No x-rays to see if things were healing correctly. Just splints and hope and prayer. Dental problems would be agonizing. You'd get cavities. Everyone got cavities. The medieval diet was low in sugar, but hard bread would wear down your teeth and create opportunities for decay. Once you had a cavity, it would hurt. Constantly. Throbbing pain that never stopped. The solution was extraction. A barber or tooth puller would yank the tooth out with pliers while you screamed. No anesthesia. No pain management. Just raw physical force applied to your jaw until the tooth came free. Then you'd hope the socket didn't get infected, because infected tooth sockets could kill you. Childbirth was Russian roulette with extra steps. If you were a woman, pregnancy was something that happened to you repeatedly throughout your fertile years, because contraception didn't really exist. You'd get pregnant and you'd carry the baby to term, and you'd give birth in your home with whatever help was available. Maybe a midwife if you were lucky, maybe just your mother or neighbour, and you'd hope everything went right, because if it didn't, you died. The maternal mortality rate was staggering. Somewhere between 1 and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death, which doesn't sound like much until you realise that medieval women had an average of 6 to 8 pregnancies. Do the math. Over a reproductive lifetime, your chances of dying in childbirth were approaching 10 to 20%. 1 in 5 women died bringing life into the world. The causes were numerous: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour where the baby couldn't pass through the birth canal, eclampsia causing seizures. Any of these could kill you, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Infant mortality was even worse. Between 20 and 30% of children died before their first birthday. Another 10 to 20% died before age 5. That's nearly half of all children dead before they reached adolescence. The causes were the same diseases we've already discussed, plus malnutrition, accidents, and simply being born too weak to survive in a world that demanded strength. Parents expected to lose children. They prepared for it emotionally. They had more children than they wanted because they knew some wouldn't make it. The grief was real, but it was also routine, which somehow makes it more heartbreaking. Your modern immune system would be laughably inadequate. You've been raised in a sterile environment. Hand sanitizer, antibacterial soap, vaccines. Your immune system has been trained on easy mode. It's never had to fight anything serious. Now drop that pampered immune system into medieval Europe, where every surface is contaminated, every water source is questionable, and every person you meet is carrying parasites and pathogens. You'd be sick constantly. Now let's talk about something you probably haven't considered: privacy, or rather, the complete and total absence of it. In your modern life, you have privacy. You have your own room, your own space, your own thoughts that nobody else can access. You can close a door and be alone. You can take a walk by yourself. You can have a private conversation. These things don't exist in medieval life. Privacy isn't a concept. It's not something people expect or desire. It's literally not part of how society functions. You'd live in a one-room dwelling with your entire extended family, parents, children, grandparents if they're still alive, possibly married siblings and their children, everyone in one room, sleeping, eating, working, arguing, having sex, giving birth, dying, all in the same shared space. There were no walls, no partitions, no separate bedrooms, just one big room with everyone living on top of each other all the time. The bedroom concept didn't exist for common people. You slept in the main room. You had sex in the main room while other people were present, just trying to sleep through it. You gave birth in the main room with your entire family as witnesses. You died in the main room surrounded by everyone. Modesty wasn't possible. Shame about bodily functions wasn't practical. Everyone saw everything. Everyone heard everything. Everyone knew everyone else's business because there was no physical way to keep secrets. Toilets didn't exist either. Not in your home anyway. You'd use a chamber pot, which is exactly what it sounds like. A pot that you peed and defecated into, kept in the corner of your one-room dwelling, used by everyone in the household. emptied once a day maybe, into a cesspit outside or just thrown into the street. The smell was constant. The lack of hygiene was absolute, and everyone just lived with it because there was no alternative. Public toilets, when they existed, were communal, a row of holes over a pit. No stalls, no dividers. You'd sit next to strangers while you relieved yourself and you'd have conversations, because why wouldn't you? Privacy during bodily functions wasn't an expectation anyone had. It was just something you did, like eating or breathing, and there was no reason to hide it. Bathing was also a public activity when it happened. Public bathhouses existed in some places. You'd go in, strip naked, and bathe with dozens of other naked people. Men and women together in many cases. The water wasn't changed between bathers. You'd be washing in water that 10 or 20 people had already used. The concepts of personal space and bodily modesty simply didn't apply the way they do in your world. Let's move to work. Because in medieval times, work wasn't something you did for 8 hours a day and then went home. Work was your entire existence. It defined who you were, where you lived, what you ate, who you could marry, and what your children would become. If you were a peasant farmer, which statistically you would be, your work started before dawn and ended after dusk. Every single day. There were no weekends. There were holy days when you couldn't work, but those weren't vacation days. Those were days you spent in church, which was mandatory, not optional. The rest of the time you worked. Farming wasn't getting on a tractor. Farming was back-breaking manual labour. You'd wake before sunrise and work until dusk. You'd plough using a wooden plough pulled by an ox if you owned one. If not, you pulled it yourself. You'd plant, weed and harvest by hand using a sickle or scythe. The ploughing alone would destroy you. Walking behind a plough all day, wrestling it through soil, fighting rocks and roots. Your back would ache, your hands would blister and bleed, then you'd do it again next season. Harvesting was worse. Bent over in fields, cutting grain, binding sheaves, hauling them to storage. Hours of repetitive motion in hot sun. Your back would seize up, your hands would cramp, and you couldn't stop because if you didn't harvest, you didn't eat. Between planting and harvesting, you'd maintain fields. Weeding was constant. You'd spend days on your hands and knees pulling weeds. The sun would cook you. The dirt would get everywhere. You'd also maintain your dwelling. Repair tools, tend animals, gather firewood, haul water, make and repair clothing, process food for storage. There was no specialization. You did everything yourself because paying someone else wasn't an option. The concept of career choice didn't exist. You did what your father did. If he was a farmer, you were a farmer. If he was a blacksmith, you became a blacksmith. Social mobility was essentially zero. You were born into a class and stayed there. Your lord owned you. Not legally as a slave, but functionally there wasn't much difference. You worked his land. You gave him a portion of your harvest as rent. You gave him additional days of labour as required. You needed his permission to leave his lands. You needed his permission to marry. He had the right to the first night with your bride, which, yes, was exactly as horrible as it sounds, though the practice varied by region and time period. You were tied to the land, and the land was tied to the Lord, and that was your reality from birth to death. And the work never ended. Never. There was no retirement. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore, and then you became a burden on your family who had to support you while you slowly died. Old age was not a golden period of rest and relaxation. It was a gradual descent into uselessness, poverty, and death. You'd watch yourself become weaker, more dependent, more of a drain on resources that your family couldn't spare. And you'd know that everyone was waiting for you to die so they could have one less mouth to feed. Leisure time didn't really exist. Yes, there were festivals and holy days. Yes, there were moments of celebration. But these were rare breaks in a life of constant work. The idea of hobbies, of pursuing interest for enjoyment, of having free time to do whatever you wanted, this wasn't part of medieval life for common people. Every moment was spoken for. Every hour was needed for survival. You worked or you died. Those were the options. Education wasn't available. Most people couldn't read or write. They didn't need to. Reading and writing were skills for clergy and nobility and merchants. You were a farmer. You needed to know how to farm. That knowledge was passed down orally from parent to child. You learned by doing, by watching, by making mistakes, and hoping those mistakes didn't kill you. Books didn't exist for you. Schools didn't exist for you. The sum total of human knowledge might as well not exist because you had no access to it, and no time to pursue it even if you did. The boredom would be crushing. After working 16 hours in the fields, you'd come home to your one-room dwelling where there was nothing to do. No books to read, no screens to watch, no music to listen to unless someone in your family could play an instrument, which was unlikely. You'd sit by the fire and talk. That was entertainment, conversation. Maybe someone would tell a story they'd heard from a travelling merchant. Maybe someone would sing a song, but mostly you'd just sit there, tired, hungry, sore, waiting for it to be late enough to justify going to sleep so you could wake up tomorrow and do it all again. The isolation would be profound. You'd live in a small village, maybe 100 people, maybe less. You'd know everyone. You'd be related to half of them. The same faces every day for your entire life. Strangers were rare and distrusted. News from the outside world came slowly, through travelling merchants or visiting clergy, and it was usually weeks or months old by the time it reached you. You had no idea what was happening in the next kingdom over. You barely knew what was happening in the next village. Your entire world was a few square miles of land and the people who lived on it. Your mental health would deteriorate. The constant stress, the lack of variety, the repetitive nature of work, the absence of hope for anything better, all of this would wear you down. Depression would be common but unrecognised. Anxiety would be constant but unnamed. You'd just feel bad all the time, and you'd have no framework to understand why or what to do about it. Mental illness wasn't treated. It wasn't even really acknowledged as a thing that existed. You were either sane or possessed by demons, and if you were possessed by demons, the treatment was prayer or exorcism, or being locked away from society. Let's talk about violence, because medieval life was violent in ways that would traumatize you immediately. Violence wasn't hidden or regulated or controlled by a functional justice system. Violence was public, brutal, and frequent. You'd witness things that would haunt you for the rest of your life, and everyone would just treat it as normal because it was normal. Public executions were entertainment. When someone was convicted of a crime, they'd be executed in the town, square with everyone watching. Men, women, children, everyone came out to see it. Hangings were common, beheadings if the criminal was nobility, burning at the stake for heresy. These weren't sombre occasions. They were social events. People would bring food. They'd make a day of it. They'd cheer when the condemned died. Children would grow up watching people being killed publicly, and this was considered normal socialization. The methods of execution were deliberately cruel. The goal wasn't just to kill the criminal, but to make them suffer as a warning to others. Drawing and quartering involved being hanged until almost dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded, then having your body cut into quarters. Burning at the stake meant exactly what it sounds like. Tied to a pole and set on fire, dying slowly from smoke inhalation and burns while everyone watched. The breaking wheel involved having your limbs broken with a hammer and then being left to die on a wheel. These punishments were real. They happened regularly, and everyone accepted them as necessary. Torture was legal and common. If you were accused of a crime, you could be tortured to extract a confession. The methods varied, but they were all designed to cause maximum pain. The rack stretched your body until joints dislocated. Thumbscrews crushed your fingers. The boot crushed your foot and ankle. The Iron Maiden was actually a myth, but plenty of other devices were real and in regular use, and these weren't reserved for serious crimes. You could be tortured for theft, for lying, for basically anything the authorities decided warranted it. War was constant. Not necessarily in your specific village, but somewhere in the region there was always a war happening. Lords fought each other over territory. Kingdoms fought each other over succession. Crusades were called and armies marched off to fight in distant lands, and when armies moved they destroyed everything in their path. Fields were burned, villages were raided, food was stolen, people were killed or enslaved. Even if you weren't directly involved in the fighting, war affected you. Armies needed to eat, and they didn't ask permission before taking your harvest. Bandits were another constant threat. Groups of armed men who lived by robbery and violence. They'd hide in forests and ambush travellers. They'd raid isolated farms. They'd kidnap people for ransom. There was no police force to stop them, no organised law enforcement. Maybe the local lord would send soldiers after particularly troublesome bandit groups, but most of the time bandits operated with impunity because catching them was difficult and expensive, and most lords didn't care enough to try. Personal violence was common: bar fights, domestic abuse, fights over honour or insults. People carried knives for practical purposes, and those knives could quickly become weapons. Arguments escalated to violence regularly because there was no social framework for de-escalation. You didn't call the cops when someone threatened you. You either backed down or you fought, and fights could easily turn lethal. The law itself was violent. Trial by combat was a legitimate legal procedure. If you were accused of something and you denied it, you could demand trial by combat. You'd fight your accuser, and whoever won was deemed to be in the right. God would favour the innocent and grant them victory. That was the logic. In practice, it meant that being good at fighting made you right, which was a terrible foundation for a justice system, but nobody cared. Trial by ordeal was another option. You'd be subjected to some painful or dangerous test, and if you survived or healed properly, you were innocent. Trial by fire involved carrying a hot iron bar for a certain distance. If your burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. Trial by water involved being thrown into water. If you floated, you were guilty of witchcraft. If you sank, you were innocent, though you might drown in the process. These weren't metaphorical tests. They were actual legal procedures used to determine guilt or innocence. Domestic life was violent too. Beating your wife was legal and socially acceptable. Beating your children was expected. Discipline was physical. If someone misbehaved, you hit them. That was how society maintained order. The idea of non-violent conflict resolution didn't exist. Violence was the default response to problems. Now let's discuss religion, because you couldn't escape it even if you wanted to. The church controlled everything. Not just spiritual matters, but temporal ones too. The church owned massive amounts of land. It collected taxes called tithes. It had its own courts. It dictated what you could and couldn't do, what you could and couldn't believe, what you could and couldn't say. And there was no separation between church and state. The church was the state in many practical ways. You were required to attend church, every Sunday without exception. Missing church was a sin and potentially a crime. You'd go to your local church and sit through a service conducted entirely in Latin, which you didn't understand. The priest would perform rituals that made no sense to you. He'd give a sermon that you might or might not comprehend, depending on whether he bothered to translate it into the vernacular. You'd stand for hours because pews weren't common. Your feet would hurt, your back would ache, and you'd do this every single week because you had no choice. Holy days were numerous. You couldn't work on holy days. Sounds nice until you realise that not working meant not eating unless you'd prepared in advance. And there were a lot of holy days, dozens throughout the year. Every saint had a feast day. Every important event in the Christian calendar had a celebration. You'd spend a significant portion of the year unable to work because the church said so. The tithes were mandatory. You'd give 10% of your harvest to the church. Not 10% of your surplus. 10% of everything you grew. This was on top of the portion you owed to your Lord. So before you fed yourself or your family, you'd give away a quarter or more of your crop, and you couldn't refuse. Refusing to pay tithes was heresy. Heresy could get you excommunicated, which meant you were cut off from the church and all its sacraments, which meant you'd go to hell when you died, so you paid. The church's moral authority was absolute. If the church said something was a sin, it was a sin. If the church said something was required, it was required. There was no room for personal interpretation or disagreement. Questioning church doctrine was heresy. Reading the Bible in your own language was heresy. Saying that maybe the priests were corrupt, or that the church was too wealthy, or that the Pope's policies were questionable, all heresy. And heresy was punished severely. The Inquisition was real. It existed to root out heresy. If you were accused of heresy, you'd be investigated, often involving torture. If found guilty, you'd be executed. The church would condemn you and hand you to secular authorities to burn you at the stake. Your beliefs weren't private. The church wanted public displays of faith. You had to go to confession, participate in festivals, demonstrate piety constantly. Neighbours would report you if you seemed insufficiently devout. Superstition was everywhere. People believed in demons, witches, evil spirits and curses. If your cow died, maybe it was cursed. If your crop failed, maybe God was punishing you. If someone got sick, maybe they were possessed. These were mainstream views held by basically everyone. Witch hunts would happen periodically. Someone would accuse someone else of witchcraft, usually a woman who was too old, too poor, or too different. The accused would be arrested and tortured until she confessed. Then she'd be burned while the whole town watched. Your entire worldview would be shaped by the church. Your understanding of how the world worked, why things happened, what was good and what was evil, all filtered through religious doctrine. Everything was interpreted through a religious lens. Natural disasters were God's punishment. Disease was caused by sin. Success was divine favour. Failure was divine judgment. You couldn't escape this framework even if you wanted to. The lack of knowledge would kill you in ways you haven't even considered. You live in a world where information is abundant and accessible. You can look up anything instantly. You know basic facts about health, safety, nutrition, weather patterns, geography. You know that germs cause disease even if you don't understand microbiology. You know that washing your hands prevents illness even if you don't know exactly why. You know that certain plants are poisonous and certain animals are dangerous. All this knowledge is so fundamental to your existence that you don't even think about it. It's just there, background radiation of modern life. Medieval people didn't have this knowledge. They had folk wisdom passed down through generations, much of which was wrong. They had superstition masquerading as fact. They had religious explanations for natural phenomena. And they had absolutely no way to verify whether any of it was true because the scientific method didn't exist yet. Medicine was particularly horrifying in its ignorance. The dominant medical theory was humorism, which held that the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a balance of these humours. Illness was an imbalance. Treatment involved restoring balance, usually through bloodletting, which is exactly what it sounds like, cutting you open and letting blood flow out until the physician decided you'd lost enough. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything: fever, bloodletting; headache, bloodletting; infection, bloodletting; pregnancy complications, bloodletting. The logic was that you had too much blood and it needed to be drained to restore balance. The reality was that you'd lose blood you actually needed, become weaker, potentially go into shock, and quite possibly die from a treatment that was supposed to help you. Leeches were another popular treatment. Literal blood-sucking worms attached to your skin to drain blood in a more controlled manner. Physicians would apply leeches to specific body parts based on where they thought the humour imbalance was located. The leeches would gorge themselves on your blood and fall off when full. This was considered advanced medicine. Trepanation was practiced for headaches and mental illness. This involved drilling a hole in your skull, while you were conscious, with a hand drill. The theory was that the hole would release evil spirits or reduce pressure on the brain. The practice was incredibly dangerous and painful, and frequently resulted in death from infection or brain damage. But it was a legitimate medical procedure. Herbal remedies existed, and some of them actually worked because they contained active compounds we still use today. Willow bark for pain, which contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. Foxglove for heart problems, which contains digitalis. But medieval people didn't know why these worked. They didn't know dosages. They didn't understand side effects or drug interactions. They just knew that sometimes these plants helped and sometimes they didn't, and they had no framework for understanding the difference. Many herbal remedies were completely useless. Crushed pearls for poison, unicorn horn for various ailments, which was actually narwhal tusk and did nothing, powdered mummy for basically everything, which yes, involved grinding up actual Egyptian mummies and consuming them. The placebo effect probably helped some people. The rest suffered through illnesses while taking treatments that did nothing. Surgery existed, but it was brutal. No anesthesia except maybe alcohol to dull the pain. No antiseptic technique. Surgeons would operate with unwashed hands using unsterilized tools. They'd cut into your body while you screamed and thrashed. Someone would hold you down. The surgeon would work as fast as possible because speed was the only mercy available. Then they'd stitch you up with thread that hadn't been sterilised and bandage you with cloth that was probably contaminated and hope you didn't die from infection. Amputations were common for serious injuries to limbs. Crushed arm, amputate. Infected leg, amputate. Gangrene, amputate. The procedure involved sawing through bone while you were conscious. The pain would be indescribable. Many people died from shock during the amputation. Many more died from infection afterward. The lucky survivors lived the rest of their lives disabled in a society that had no support systems for disabled people. Your modern medical knowledge wouldn't help you. You might know that germs cause disease, but you couldn't see germs. You couldn't prove they existed. If you told a medieval physician about germs, they'd think you were insane. You might know that bloodletting is harmful, but you couldn't stop physicians from doing it to you. You might know proper surgical technique, but you had no way to implement it without the tools and materials that make it possible. Nutrition science didn't exist. People knew you needed food to live. They knew that not eating made you weak and eventually killed you. But they didn't understand calories, vitamins, minerals, proteins, carbohydrates, or any of the nutritional science we take for granted. They ate what was available and hoped it was enough. Vitamin deficiencies were common and poorly understood. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C caused your gums to bleed, your teeth to fall out, old wounds to reopen, and eventually death. It was common among sailors and people who went long periods without fresh fruits or vegetables. The cure was citrus fruit or fresh vegetables, but people didn't know this for centuries. They tried various treatments that didn't work while a simple dietary change would have solved the problem. Rickets from lack of vitamin D caused bone deformities in children. Weak bones, bowed legs, skeletal problems. It was widespread in northern climates where sun exposure was limited. The cure was sunlight and foods rich in vitamin D like fish liver oil. But again, people didn't know this. They just watched their children develop deformities and assumed it was God's will or bad luck. Pellagra from lack of niacin caused dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. It was common in populations that relied heavily on corn without processing it with alkali, which makes the niacin bioavailable. People would develop skin lesions, digestive problems, mental deterioration. They'd think it was a plague or curse. They'd never connect it to diet because the concept didn't exist. Food safety was a nightmare. You couldn't tell if meat was safe by looking at it. You couldn't detect bacterial contamination. You couldn't know if preserved food had gone bad in ways that would make you sick. You just ate what you had and hoped your stomach could handle it. Mouldy grain was common, and some moulds produced toxins that cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Ergot fungus on rye produced ergotism, which caused gangrene in extremities and intense hallucinations. Entire villages would be affected when the grain supply was contaminated. People would think they were possessed by demons or being punished by God. They'd see visions, feel their limbs burning, watch their fingers and toes turn black and die. And they had no idea it was the bread. Food poisoning was regular. Spoiled meat, contaminated water, improperly preserved vegetables. You'd get violently ill. Vomiting, diarrhea, fever, dehydration. It might pass in a few days if you were lucky. It might kill you if you weren't. There was no way to know which it would be. No treatment except waiting and hoping. Environmental knowledge was similarly lacking. Weather prediction was based on folklore and observation. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in morning, sailor's warning. Some of these folk sayings had grains of truth based on atmospheric patterns, but they were unreliable. You couldn't predict storms with any accuracy. You couldn't prepare for droughts or floods or early frosts. You just dealt with whatever weather happened and hoped you'd survive it. Astronomy was mixed up with astrology. People knew the stars moved in predictable patterns. They used these patterns for navigation and calendar keeping. But they also believed the stars influenced human affairs, that your fate was determined by which constellation was rising when you were born, that planetary alignments caused events on Earth. Astronomy and astrology were the same field. There was no distinction between measuring celestial movements and believing those movements controlled your life. Geography was limited to what people could physically travel to and map. The world beyond Europe was mysterious and filled with legends. People believed in dog-headed men, people with no heads but faces on their chests, dragons, sea monsters, lands where gold was common as dirt. Maps included these fantastical elements alongside real geographical features, because nobody knew what was real and what wasn't. Navigation was primitive. Compasses existed but weren't always reliable. Maps were inaccurate. Distance measurements were rough estimates. If you travelled beyond your local area, you might get lost easily. There were no road signs, no GPS, no reliable maps, just verbal directions from people who might not know the way themselves. Timekeeping was imprecise. Mechanical clocks existed in some places by late medieval period, but they were rare and not very accurate. Most people told time by the sun's position or church bells. Morning, noon, afternoon, evening, that was as specific as it got. The concept of precise scheduling didn't exist because you couldn't measure time precisely. The seasons dictated everything. You planted in spring, grew in summer, harvested in fall, survived in winter. Every year the same cycle. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't change it. You couldn't even fully predict it because climate varies, and you had no long-range forecasting. You just followed the patterns your ancestors followed, and hoped this year wouldn't be the year everything went wrong. Crop rotation was practiced in some places, but not understood scientifically. People knew that if you planted the same crop in the same field year after year, yields decreased. So they rotated crops or let fields lie fallow. But they didn't know about nitrogen fixation or soil nutrients. They just knew it worked based on experience. Animal husbandry was similarly experiential. People knew that breeding strong animals produced strong offspring. They knew that sick animals should be isolated. They knew basic care techniques, but they didn't understand genetics or disease transmission in animals. They just applied what had worked in the past and hoped for the best. Your literacy would be worthless, even if you could read and write, which already puts you ahead of 90% of the medieval population. What would you read? There were no books accessible to common people. Books were hand-copied manuscripts, expensive and rare, owned by churches and nobility. The content was mostly religious texts in Latin, legal documents, or classical works. Nothing that would help you survive. Writing materials were expensive. Parchment was made from animal skins, a labour-intensive process. Paper existed but was costly. Ink had to be made. Quills had to be prepared. The act of writing was slow and required skill. You couldn't just jot down notes. Writing was for important documents only, handled by professional scribes. Even if you wrote something down, who would read it? Most people couldn't read. Literacy was a specialised skill limited to clergy, nobility, and some merchants. Your written knowledge would be inaccessible to the people around you. They'd rely on oral tradition and apprenticeship for learning. Your attempts to record information would be seen as strange or suspicious. The concept of progress didn't exist. People didn't believe the future would be better than the past. They looked backward to a golden age, either the classical period or biblical times. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. Change was dangerous. The old ways were good ways because they'd been proven over generations. If you tried to introduce new ideas or methods, people would resist. Why fix what isn't broken? Why risk change when stability is precious? So here you are. No medical knowledge that anyone will believe. No nutritional understanding. No scientific method. No accurate geography. No reliable way to record or share information. No belief in progress. You're trapped in a society that has all the wrong answers and no way to discover the right ones. And this ignorance will kill you just as surely as disease or violence or hunger. Let's talk about something that would break you psychologically. The sheer hopelessness of medieval life. In your world, things get better. Technology advances. Medicine improves. Living standards rise. You can look at your grandparents' generation and see how much harder their lives were. You can look at your children's generation and expect their lives to be easier. Progress is the default assumption. The future will be better than the present, which is better than the past. Medieval people had no such hope. Their lives were the same as their parents' lives, which were the same as their grandparents' lives, which would be the same as their children's lives. generation after generation living in the same conditions, doing the same work, facing the same struggles. Nothing ever got better, nothing ever changed. You were born into your station, and you died in your station, and that was it. The psychological weight of knowing that nothing will ever improve would crush you. You're working 16-hour days in the fields, barely surviving, watching your children die, getting sick constantly, and you know with absolute certainty that this is all there is. This is your life, forever, until you die. And your children will have the exact same life, and their children, and so on into perpetuity. There's no American dream in medieval times, no belief that hard work leads to prosperity. You could work yourself to death and still die poor. You could be the most skilled farmer in your village and still lose everything to a bad harvest. Success and failure were determined by factors completely outside your control. The weather, the Lord's whims, war, plague, sheer random chance. Your efforts mattered very little in the grand scheme of things. The class system was absolutely rigid. You were a peasant. Your children would be peasants. Your grandchildren would be peasants. No amount of talent, hard work, or intelligence would change this. A peasant who was brilliant at mathematics would spend his life ploughing fields. A peasant who was gifted at strategy would spend her life weaving cloth. Potential meant nothing. Birth meant everything. Occasionally someone would rise above their station, but it was so rare as to be legendary. A peasant becoming a merchant was noteworthy. A peasant becoming a knight was nearly impossible. A peasant becoming a noble was literally impossible unless you were already illegitimate nobility hiding among peasants, which is how most stories of peasants rising to nobility actually worked. The church offered one path out of poverty through becoming clergy, but even this was limited. You needed education to join the church, and education required literacy, and literacy required someone willing to teach you, and that required access to books and teachers and time that you didn't have. Most clergy came from families wealthy enough to support their education. A true peasant becoming a bishop was vanishingly rare. Marriage wasn't about love. Marriage was an economic arrangement. You married whoever your parents arranged, usually someone from your village of similar status. Love might develop or it might not. Either way, you were stuck with this person for life because divorce wasn't an option. You'd likely marry young. Girls at 14 or 15, boys at 16 or 17. You'd go from childhood to marriage to childbirth to old age in what would feel like a brutal sprint. Adolescence as a distinct life phase didn't exist. Adultery was heavily punished, especially for women. A man caught in adultery might face fines. A woman caught could be executed. The double standard was explicit. A woman's value was tied to her chastity and her ability to bear legitimate children. Children were property. Parents owned their children literally. Children worked as soon as physically capable. 5-year-olds helped with chores. 7-year-olds worked in fields. Childhood as a protected period didn't exist for common people. Orphans faced terrible fates. No institutional support existed. If your parents died, you might be taken in by relatives if lucky. If not, you'd be on your own. Child beggars were common. Many didn't survive to adulthood. The elderly were burdens. Once you couldn't work, you had no value. You'd rely on family charity. There were no pensions, no retirement homes, no social safety net. You either had family willing to support you or you starved. Disability was a catastrophe. Break your leg badly, crippled for life, lose a hand. Your ability to work is permanently reduced. There was no disability support, no accommodations. You either had family willing to support you or you begged or you died. Mental illness was understood as demonic possession or divine punishment. If you developed schizophrenia, people would think you were possessed. Treatment would be exorcism, which might involve beatings, starvation, or being chained up. The idea that mental illness was a medical condition didn't exist. The powerlessness would be suffocating. Your Lord controlled your work. The church controlled your beliefs. Your family controlled your marriage. Society controlled your behavior through rigid expectations. There was no personal freedom, no autonomy, no choice, and the punishment could be brutal for minor infractions. Talking back to your Lord? Whipping? Missing church? public humiliation, stealing food because you were starving, hanging. The punishments were disproportionate because the goal was social control through fear. Protest was futile and dangerous. Peasant rebellions happened occasionally, always crushed brutally. Leaders would be executed publicly. Nothing fundamental ever changed. The system was too entrenched. You'd live your entire life knowing you don't matter. You're replaceable. One peasant among millions, all living the same desperate existence. The psychological damage of understanding your own insignificance would be profound and inescapable. Let's discuss the physical degradation that medieval life would inflict on your body. You're used to modern conveniences that protect you from wear and tear. Ergonomic chairs, supportive shoes, climate control, 8 hours of sleep, regular meals, access to healthcare. Your body has been coddled. It has no idea what's about to hit it. Within the first month, your hands would be destroyed. Modern hands are soft. Your skin is smooth. Your calluses are minimal. You might have a callus from holding a pen or using a computer mouse. Medieval work would shred your hands. Ploughing fields, wielding tools, hauling water, chopping wood. Every task would tear at your skin. You'd develop blisters. The blisters would pop. The raw skin underneath would crack and bleed. Eventually you'd develop calluses thick enough to protect you, but the process of getting there would be excruciating. Your back would give out. Medieval work destroyed backs. Constant bending, lifting, carrying heavy loads, working in awkward positions for hours. You'd develop chronic pain within weeks. Your lower back would ache constantly. Your spine would compress. You'd lose height as your vertebrae ground together. By middle age, you'd be stooped. By old age, you'd be bent almost double. Everyone was. Chronic back pain was universal among people who did physical labour, which was everyone except the nobility. Your feet would be a disaster. Medieval shoes were terrible. Leather that offered minimal protection. No arch support. No cushioning. No waterproofing. You'd walk on rough ground all day every day. Stone paths if you were lucky. Dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained. Your feet would be covered in calluses and corns and blisters. You'd probably lose toenails from impacts and pressure. Fungal infections would be common because your feet were always damp and you couldn't keep them clean. Your knees would deteriorate from kneeling constantly. Weeding fields, scrubbing floors, praying in church, all done on your knees. The cartilage would wear down. You'd develop arthritis young. By your 30s, you'd struggle to kneel. By your 40s, you'd struggle to walk. Medieval skeletons show massive joint deterioration at ages when modern people are still active and healthy. Your shoulders would be permanently damaged from carrying loads. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams. Firewood had to be carried from forests. Harvested grain had to be transported from fields. Everything was carried on your back or shoulders or in your arms. The constant weight would compress your shoulders, damage your rotator cuffs, create chronic pain that never went away. Repetitive motion injuries would be severe. Threshing grain involved the same motion thousands of times. Spinning thread involved repetitive hand movements for hours daily. Any craft or trade had its specific repetitive motions that would damage the body over time. Blacksmith's shoulders, weaver's hands, miller's backs, every profession had its characteristic injuries. Your teeth would fall out. We've already discussed dental care, but let's emphasize how bad it would get. By your 20s, you'd be missing teeth. By your 30s, you'd have gaps throughout your mouth. By your 40s, you might have more missing teeth than present teeth. Eating would become difficult. You'd have to avoid hard foods. You'd develop a preference for soft, mushy foods, not because you liked them, but because you couldn't chew anything else. Your eyesight would deteriorate, and there'd be nothing you could do about it. If you needed glasses, tough luck. Eyeglasses existed by late medieval period, but they were expensive luxury items, reading glasses for scholars and merchants who could afford them. If you developed myopia or presbyopia, you'd just have to live with blurry vision. If you developed cataracts, you'd go blind. There was a surgery for cataracts that involved couching, which meant pushing the lens back into the eye with a needle. This was done without anesthesia and frequently resulted in infection and total blindness. Your hearing would be damaged by constant noise, blacksmiths working near forges, farmers shouting over wind, bells ringing for church, screaming children, livestock. Everyone talked loudly because everyone was going deaf from environmental noise. By middle age, your hearing would be noticeably worse. By old age, you'd struggle to hear normal conversation. Malnutrition would weaken your entire body. Even if you ate enough calories to survive, you wouldn't be getting proper nutrition. Vitamin deficiencies would make your bones brittle, your muscles weak, your immune system compromised. You'd be susceptible to every illness that came through. You'd heal slowly from injuries. Your body would be in a constant state of nutritional stress. Parasites would be your constant companions. Intestinal worms were universal. Literally everyone had them. Roundworms, tapeworms, pinworms, various other species. They'd live in your digestive system, feeding on your food, reproducing, laying eggs that you'd pass in your feces and then potentially re-ingest through contaminated food or water. The cycle was endless. You'd have stomach cramps, diarrhea, unexplained weight loss, and no understanding of what was causing it. External parasites were equally ubiquitous. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, ticks. They'd live in your clothing, your hair, your bedding. They'd bite you constantly. You'd be itchy all the time. Scratching would be automatic, unconscious. The bites would sometimes get infected from scratching with dirty fingernails. Lice would lay eggs in your hair, and you'd have to manually pick them out. A task called nitpicking that was so common it entered the language as a metaphor. Skin conditions would be constant. Rashes from allergies, from parasites, from poor hygiene, from contact with irritating plants or materials. Boils and abscesses from bacterial infections. Fungal infections from moisture and poor hygiene. Eczema and psoriasis with no treatment available. Your skin would never be clear and healthy. You'd always have something wrong somewhere on your body. Your hair would be gross. Washing hair was infrequent and involved harsh soaps or just water. Your hair would be greasy, dirty, full of lice eggs. Women kept their hair covered partly for modesty and partly because hair was disgusting. Men kept their hair short when they could, though barbers were expensive and many people just let their hair grow wild. Body odour would be overwhelming. Everyone stank all the time. You'd stink. Your spouse would stink. Your children would stink. Your neighbours would stink. The entire community would be enveloped in a miasma of human smell. Sweat, dirt, old clothes, unwashed bodies, all combining into a scent profile that would make you gag if you could smell it from your modern perspective. But you'd adapt because you'd have no choice. Your nose would adjust and eventually you'd barely notice it. Your immune system would be under constant assault. Exposure to pathogens from contaminated water, spoiled food, sick people, animal waste, human waste. Your body would be fighting infections constantly. Low-grade fevers would be common. You'd feel sick a lot of the time. That vague, unwell feeling that tells you something isn't right. But there'd be nothing you could do except rest when you could, which was almost never, so you'd just work through it. Chronic pain would be your baseline. Something would always hurt. Your back, your hands, your feet, your knees, your shoulders, your head. Pain would be a constant companion. You'd learn to ignore it because you couldn't afford to acknowledge it. You had to work regardless of how you felt. Complaining wouldn't help. Everyone else was in pain too. It was just part of being alive. Sleep would be disrupted constantly. Uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, cold temperatures, noise from other people in your one-room dwelling, anxiety about the next day's work, hunger, pain, parasites biting you. You'd rarely get a full night of restful sleep. You'd wake up tired, you'd go through the day exhausted, you'd go to bed exhausted, and the cycle would repeat endlessly. Now let's talk about something that would absolutely horrify you, the bathroom situation. We've touched on chamber pots, but let's really dig into the full horror of medieval waste management. Because it wasn't managed. It was just waste. Everywhere. Public sanitation didn't exist. Sewers didn't exist for most of medieval Europe. Toilets as we know them didn't exist. People relieved themselves and the waste had to go somewhere. Usually that somewhere was a pit in the ground. A cesspit behind your house where all waste was dumped. Human waste, animal waste, food, scraps, any garbage. Everything went in the pit. The cesspit would fill up over time. Eventually it would need to be emptied. This job fell to gong farmers, which is medieval for the poor bastards who dug out cesspits for a living. They'd come at night, dig out the accumulated waste and cart it away to be dumped somewhere else or used as fertilizer. The smell was indescribable. The health hazards were extreme. Gong farmers died young from exposure to diseases and sometimes from drowning in liquid waste when pit walls collapsed. In towns and cities, waste management was worse. People would throw their chamber pot contents out windows into the streets, yelling "Gardy-loo" as a warning, which is medieval for watch out for the cascade of urine and feces about to rain down on you. The streets were rivers of sewage. You'd walk through it, track it into homes, get it on your clothes. Stepping in human waste was daily occurrence, not a shocking accident. Some towns had regulations about when waste could be dumped in streets, usually at night. This didn't prevent waste from being in the streets, it just concentrated the dumping into specific hours. The streets would be cleaned occasionally by rain, or by servants hired to sweep waste into gutters. But cleaned is a strong word, more like redistributed. Public latrines existed in some places. Communal toilets built over rivers or streams. The waste would fall directly into the water, the same water people downstream would use for drinking, washing and fishing. Nobody understood disease transmission, so nobody saw the problem with this arrangement. The river was convenient. It carried the waste away. What happened to people downstream wasn't your concern. Castles and large buildings had guard robes, which were basically toilets built into walls with chutes that dropped waste outside the building. If you were attacking a castle, you'd notice these chutes because waste would be streaming down the exterior walls. Defenders sometimes used guard robe chutes to dispose of waste directly onto attackers below. Truly medieval biological warfare. Monasteries and some wealthy estates had more sophisticated systems, channels that diverted waste away from living areas. Some even had flushing mechanisms using water. But these were rare exceptions. Most people dealt with waste in the most primitive ways possible. The smell of medieval towns and cities would overwhelm you. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, tanneries processing leather with urine, butchers discarding offal, all combining into a stench that would make you vomit. People burned herbs and flowers to mask the smell. They carried pomanders filled with spices. Nothing really worked. You just lived with the smell. Animals in the streets added to the waste problem. Horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, all wandering through towns and villages, all defecating wherever they pleased. Their waste mixed with human waste. During rain, it all became a soup that flowed through streets and into homes with floors below street level. Disease spread easily through this environment. Cholera from contaminated water, dysentery from fecal contamination, typhoid from poor sanitation. Plague was carried by fleas that thrived in the filth. The connection between sanitation and disease wasn't understood, but the connection existed whether people understood it or not. Your modern sensibilities about cleanliness would torture you. You've been raised to believe that cleanliness is essential, that bathrooms should be private and sanitary, that waste should be disposed of immediately and hygienically, that streets should be clean, that water should be pure. None of this existed in medieval times. You'd be living in what you'd perceive as squalor, what everyone else would consider normal. The psychological adjustment would be brutal. Every instinct would scream at you that this is wrong, this is dangerous, this is disgusting. And you'd be right. It was all those things. But you'd have no power to change it. You'd have to accept it, live with it, eventually normalize it. The cognitive dissonance would be maddening. Let's move to something equally grim. Entertainment. Or rather, the lack thereof. Your modern life is filled with entertainment options. Streaming services, video games, books, music, sports, social media, endless ways to occupy your time and attention. Medieval people had almost none of this. Most entertainment was participatory, not passive. You didn't watch entertainment, you made it. Singing songs together, telling stories, playing simple games, dancing at festivals. These were social activities that required effort and engagement. There was no sitting back and consuming content created by professionals. Holy days provided breaks from work and opportunities for festivities. Feasts when food was available, dancing, games, mystery plays performed by guilds, religious stories acted out in town squares. These were rare highlights in a life of monotony. People looked forward to holy days not just for the religious significance but for the chance to have fun. Taverns existed and provided a place to drink and socialise, if you could afford it. Most people couldn't afford regular tavern visits. Ale was cheaper than wine or mead, but even ale cost money. You'd go to the tavern occasionally for special occasions. You'd drink, talk, maybe listen to a travelling minstrel if one passed through. Then you'd go home because you had work tomorrow. Gambling was popular when people could afford it. Dice games were common. Simple card games existed by late medieval period. Gambling was officially frowned upon by the church and often illegal, but people did it anyway because it was one of the few exciting activities available. Sports existed in rough forms. Folk football, which was basically mob violence with a ball, wrestling, archery competitions, blood sports like bear baiting or cockfighting. These were violent and dangerous, and people loved them because violence was entertainment in a world where life was harsh. Storytelling was crucial entertainment. Professional storytellers would travel between towns, sharing news, gossip and tales. Epic poems memorized and recited. Folk tales passed down orally. These stories were how culture was transmitted, how history was remembered, how people understood the world. You'd gather to listen to a good storyteller the way you'd gather for a concert today. Music existed, but instruments were expensive. The wealthy had harps, lutes, various stringed instruments. Common people had simpler instruments, pipes, drums, basic woodwinds. Singing was free, so everyone sang. Work songs to pass time during labour, religious hymns, folk songs. Singing was so integral to life that it was just expected everyone could carry a tune. Reading was unavailable to most people. Books were rare and expensive. Most people couldn't read anyway. Literacy was limited to clergy, nobility, and some merchants and artisans. The idea of reading for pleasure wasn't relevant to people who couldn't read at all. Art existed primarily in religious contexts. Church decorations, illuminated manuscripts, statues of saints. Art wasn't about personal expression or aesthetic enjoyment. Art served religious and political purposes. It taught stories to illiterate populations. It demonstrated power and wealth. It honoured God. Personal art, art for art's sake, wasn't a concept. The boredom would be crushing. The same routine every day. The same conversations with the same people. The same songs. The same stories. No new inputs. No fresh experiences. Just repetition until you died. Your mind would atrophy from lack of stimulation. You'd feel it happening, and you couldn't stop it. Conversations would be limited by everyone's shared experiences. You'd talk about weather, crops, the Lord, local gossip. Nobody had travelled. Nobody had education. Every conversation would be variations on themes you'd heard 1,000 times. News travelled slowly. Something happening in the next kingdom might reach you months later. By the time you heard about it, the information would be old and distorted. You'd have no context to understand larger events. Superstition would govern daily life in ways that would drive you insane. Don't walk backwards or bad luck will follow. Throw salt over your shoulder to ward off evil. None of these did anything, but everyone believed they did, so you'd follow these arbitrary rules to avoid tempting fate. The lack of intellectual stimulation would be maddening. Your intellectual growth would stop the moment you arrived. You'd spend the rest of your life knowing less than when you started. Your education and knowledge would become liabilities. You'd know things that contradicted what everyone believed. You'd see problems nobody else recognized. And you couldn't share any of it because you'd be dismissed as crazy or dangerous. If you tried to introduce modern ideas, you'd face resistance ranging from mockery to violence. Suggest that illness is caused by tiny creatures? Lunacy. Propose that the Earth orbits the Sun? Heresy. Your attempts to help would backfire. The isolation would be absolute. You'd be surrounded by people but completely alone. Nobody would understand you. You couldn't relate to anyone on a meaningful level. You'd long for a single conversation with someone who got it, and that conversation would never come. Your sense of time would warp. Days would blur together into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Nothing would mark time except the seasons changing and the holy days. You'd look back and realize years had passed and nothing had happened. No growth, no change, no progress. Just time consumed by survival. You'd watch yourself change in ways you hated, your body breaking down, your mind dulling, your hope fading. You'd become the thing you feared, a medieval peasant going through the motions of existence waiting for it to end. The person you were would die long before your body did. Let's talk about travel. Because in medieval times, going anywhere was a nightmare. You're used to transportation being easy, fast, and safe. Cars, trains, planes. You can cross continents in hours. You can visit another country for the weekend. Medieval people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Travel was dangerous, expensive, and almost never worth the risk. Most peasants never left their village. Ever. You'd be born in your village, work in the fields surrounding it, marry someone from the same village or maybe the next one over, and die without ever seeing what lay beyond a day's walk from home. The world beyond your immediate area was abstract, theoretical, filled with dangers both real and imagined. If you did travel, you'd walk. That was it. That was the option. Walking. For days. Weeks. Months if you were going far. You wouldn't have proper shoes. You wouldn't have weather-appropriate clothing. You wouldn't have maps. You'd just walk and hope you were going the right direction. Roads were terrible. Roman roads still existed in some places, actual paved surfaces that were centuries old and better than anything medieval people could build. But most roads were dirt tracks worn by foot traffic and cartwheels. They'd be dusty in summer, muddy swamps in winter, and always rough. No signs, no markers, just paths that might lead somewhere or might peter out into nothing. Bandits were a constant threat on roads. Groups of armed men who'd rob travellers. Sometimes they'd just take your belongings. Sometimes they'd take you for ransom if they thought you were worth something. Sometimes they'd kill you for fun or to eliminate witnesses. There was no protection, no highway patrol. You travelled and hoped you didn't encounter bandits. Forests were genuinely dangerous. Wild animals still roamed Europe. Wolves were common and would attack humans, especially in winter when food was scarce. Bears existed in forested areas. Wild boars could gore you with their tusks. You'd hear stories of travellers being killed by animals, and you'd have no way to verify if the stories were true, but you'd believe them because why wouldn't you? Rivers and streams were obstacles. Bridges were rare and often in poor repair. You'd have to ford rivers, wading through water that could be knee-deep or waist-deep or over your head, depending on recent rainfall. You'd get wet. Your belongings would get wet. You might drown if you picked the wrong spot to cross. Weather could kill you while travelling. Caught in rain without shelter, you'd be soaked, cold, miserable. Caught in snow, you could freeze to death. Caught in extreme heat with no shade and limited water, heat stroke. The environment wasn't controlled. It didn't care about your survival. You either prepared adequately or you suffered. Food and water while travelling were problems. You'd need to carry provisions or hope to find villages where you could buy or beg for food. Water sources might be contaminated. You wouldn't know until you got sick. Starvation and dehydration were real risks on longer journeys. Sleeping arrangements were grim. You'd sleep outside most nights, on the ground, with whatever protection from elements you could improvise. Maybe you'd find an inn in a town. Maybe not. Inns were expensive and often flea-ridden. You'd share a bed with strangers. You'd have no security for your possessions. Theft was common. Navigation was guesswork. Ask for directions and hope people knew what they were talking about. Follow the sun during day, the stars at night. Look for landmarks that might or might not still exist. Get lost frequently. Wander in circles. Arrive at the wrong destination. Miss your destination entirely. Pilgrimage was the main legitimate reason for long-distance travel for common people. Going to visit holy sites, to pray at shrines, to seek blessings or healing. Pilgrims wore identifying badges and clothes that marked them as pilgrims, which offered some protection from robbery and violence because attacking pilgrims was sacrilege. Some protection, not total protection. Merchants travelled for trade, but this was a profession, not casual travel. Merchants understood the risks and factored them into their prices. They travelled in groups for safety. They knew the routes. They had contacts in different towns. Even with all these advantages, merchant mortality rates were significant. Messages travelled slowly. Sending a letter meant finding someone who was travelling in the right direction and paying them to carry it. The letter might arrive in weeks or months. It might never arrive. There was no postal service, no guaranteed delivery, no tracking. Communication over distance was unreliable at best. You couldn't just decide to move to a new place and start over. You were tied to your lord's land. Moving required permission. New. Locations required you to establish yourself with new lords, new communities, new churches. Starting fresh wasn't a concept. Your past followed you through social networks and church records. The isolation would be suffocating. Your entire world would be a tiny geographic area. You'd know every tree, every rock, every path. You'd see the same landscape every day until you died. The monotony would be crushing. You'd fantasize about what lay beyond the horizon and know you'd never see it. Now let's discuss something that would break you emotionally. The treatment of animals. You probably like animals. You might have pets. You believe animals deserve humane treatment. Medieval people viewed animals as tools, property, and food sources. Nothing more. Horses were valuable because they could work. Plough fields, pull carts, carry riders. They were beaten to make them obey. Worked until they collapsed. Fed minimally to save costs. When a horse couldn't work anymore, it was killed and possibly eaten or left to die. No retirement pastures for old horses. No veterinary care beyond rudimentary first aid. Dogs were working animals. Hunting dogs, guard dogs, herding dogs. They were trained through violence. Beat a dog enough and it learned. Feed it enough to keep it alive and working, nothing more. A dog that couldn't perform its function was worthless and would be abandoned or killed. Cats existed to kill rodents. That was their value. They weren't pets. They weren't given affection or care. They lived around human settlements catching mice and rats. If they were good at it, they survived. If not, they starved. During certain periods, cats were associated with witchcraft and killed en masse, which led to rodent population explosions and helped spread plague. Livestock were meat and labour. Cattle pulled ploughs and provided milk until they were slaughtered. Pigs were raised in filth, fed garbage and butchered. Chickens were kept for eggs and meat. Sheep were sheared for wool and eventually killed. The animals' experiences of life didn't matter. Their utility was all that counted. Animal slaughter was public and brutal. No slaughterhouses with humane killing methods. Animals were killed in streets, in courtyards, wherever was convenient. Throats cut, bodies butchered where they fell, blood running in gutters, guts and offal thrown to dogs or into waste pits. Children grew up watching this and thought it was normal. Because it was normal. Blood sports were popular entertainment. Bear baiting involved chaining a bear to a post and setting dogs on it. The bear would fight for its life while crowd cheered. Bull baiting was similar. Cockfighting pitted roosters against each other in fights to the death. These weren't considered cruel. They were fun. Community events. Social occasions. Hunting was for nobility, but the methods were cruel by modern standards. Deer would be chased by dogs until exhausted, then killed. Boars would be speared while dogs held them. Birds would be shot with arrows or caught in nets. The suffering of the animals wasn't a consideration. The thrill of the hunt and the meat were all that mattered. Your horror at animal treatment would isolate you further. You couldn't stop it. You couldn't even criticize it without being thought insane. Caring about animal suffering was literally incomprehensible to medieval people. They'd think you were joking or crazy. The casual cruelty would wear you down. Watching animals beaten daily, seeing starving dogs, witnessing public slaughter, hearing animals in pain and knowing nobody else cared. The moral injury would accumulate until you couldn't feel anymore. You'd have to shut down that part of yourself to survive. Let's shift to something you haven't thought about: pregnancy and women's health. If you're a woman, pregnancy would define most of your adult life. If you're a man, you'd watch your wife go through repeated pregnancies that might kill her. Either way, the experience would be traumatic. Women started having children young, as soon as they were married and fertile. 14, 15, 16 years old. Their bodies weren't fully developed. The risks were higher. But nobody cared about optimal childbearing age. You married when your family arranged it, and you started producing children immediately. Contraception didn't really exist. Some folk methods were attempted, herbs that might or might not work, barriers made from animal intestines for the wealthy, timing intercourse around what they incorrectly believed was the fertile period. None of it was reliable. Pregnancy just happened, repeatedly, until menopause or death. Pregnancy without modern prenatal care was dangerous. No ultrasounds to detect problems, no blood tests to check health markers, no screening for genetic conditions, no way to know if the baby was positioned correctly until labour started. You'd be pregnant and hope everything was fine. Morning sickness without understanding what caused it, nausea for weeks or months, vomiting, food aversions, and you'd still have to work, still have to maintain the household, still have to care for your existing children. There was no bed rest unless you were literally dying. Complications during pregnancy had no treatments. Gestational diabetes, unknown condition, preeclampsia, mysterious illness, placental problems, discovered during labour when it was too late, ectopic pregnancy, almost certainly fatal. Women died from pregnancy complications that are easily managed today. Labour was attended by midwives if you could afford one. The midwife had experiential knowledge, techniques passed down through practice, but no medical training, no sterilisation procedures, no pain management except maybe alcohol or herbs, no interventions beyond what hands could do. Labour could last hours or days, painful, exhausting, dangerous hours or days. You'd scream, you'd bleed, you'd tear, and you'd hope the baby came out alive and that you survived the process. The midwife would do her best. Sometimes her best wasn't enough. Breech births were often death sentences. The baby positioned wrong couldn't be delivered safely without modern techniques. The midwife might try to turn the baby manually. This was agonising and didn't always work. If the baby couldn't be delivered, both mother and child would die. Hemorrhaging during or after birth killed countless women. Massive blood loss that couldn't be stopped. No blood transfusions. No surgical interventions. You'd bleed out while the midwife tried ineffective remedies and prayed. Infections after birth were common killers. Childbed fever, caused by bacteria introduced during delivery by unwashed hands and unsterilised tools. Fever, pain, deterioration, death within days. It wouldn't happen to everyone, but it happened often enough that every woman knew women who died this way. The baby might not survive. Stillbirths were common. Babies born with conditions incompatible with life. Babies too small or weak to thrive. About a third of babies died before their first birthday. You'd give birth knowing the child might not live and trying not to get too attached too quickly. Postpartum recovery was non-existent. You'd give birth and immediately return to work. Household still needed maintaining. Other children still needed care. Fields still needed tending. Your torn body would have to heal while you continued labouring. Rest wasn't an option. Breastfeeding was the only infant nutrition option. Formula didn't exist. If you couldn't produce milk, you'd hire a wet nurse if wealthy. If poor, you'd try animal milk knowing it would probably kill the baby. Most babies who couldn't breastfeed died. You'd be pregnant and nursing simultaneously. Get pregnant while still nursing the previous child. Your body would be constantly drained. Supporting a fetus while feeding an infant. The nutritional demands were extreme. Malnutrition was inevitable. Multiple pregnancies would destroy your body. Pelvic floor damage from repeated births. Tooth loss from calcium depletion. Hemorrhoids. Varicose veins. Chronic pain. Permanent physical changes that made you old before your time. Women in their 30s looked like they were in their 50s. Menopause would be a relief. The end of pregnancy risk. But it would come with its own problems. No hormone therapy. Hot flashes. Mood changes. Bone density loss. All unmanaged. You'd just endure the symptoms and age rapidly. If you were a man watching your wife go through this, the helplessness would be agonising. You'd watch her suffer and know it would happen again. You'd watch her risk death with each pregnancy. You'd watch her body break down. And you couldn't stop it because this was just how life worked. This was normal. This was what women did. The guilt and fear would haunt you. Women's health issues beyond pregnancy were ignored or misunderstood. Menstrual cramps. Just pain you had to endure. Endometriosis? Unknown condition that you'd suffer through thinking something was wrong with you. You'd just be labelled barren if you couldn't conceive, and your worth would plummet. Menstruation itself was taboo. No sanitary products as you know them. Women used rags that they'd wash and reuse. These rags would be stained and probably carrying bacteria. You'd bleed through your clothing sometimes. Everyone would know you were menstruating, and it was shameful. Rape and sexual assault were endemic. Women had no legal protections. Marital rape wasn't a concept. Your husband had rights to your body. Rape outside marriage was treated as property crime. The woman's trauma didn't matter. Sexual double standards were crushing. Men could have affairs with minimal consequences. Women caught in affairs could be killed legally in many places. There was no winning. Now let's discuss something that would destroy your mental health in ways you haven't considered. The complete lack of privacy we touched on earlier, but let's really examine what that means psychologically. You've never truly been without privacy. You've always had the ability to be alone when you wanted, to process your thoughts privately, to have moments that were just yours. Medieval life offered none of this. Every moment was shared, every thought was potentially observed, every action was potentially judged. The constant surveillance by your community would be suffocating. Everyone knew your business because there was no way to keep anything private. Your dwelling had one room. You couldn't escape your family. You couldn't have a moment alone. You couldn't process grief privately. You couldn't celebrate joy without everyone participating. Your emotional life would be public performance. Always. The village knew everything about everyone. Who was sleeping with whom? Who was having marital problems? Who was struggling financially? Who was sick? Who was pregnant? Nothing was secret. The gossip network was comprehensive and relentless. Information spread faster than you could imagine. This meant you could never relax, never let your guard down, never show weakness that could be used against you, never admit doubts or fears because they'd become public knowledge. You'd have to maintain a social mask constantly, and the psychological energy required would be exhausting. Conformity was enforced through social pressure. Dress like everyone else, act like everyone else, believe what everyone else believes. Deviation was punished swiftly and harshly, not through laws necessarily, but through shunning, mockery, and exclusion. Being different was dangerous. The pressure to conform would crush your individuality. Modern you values self-expression. You believe you have the right to be yourself. Medieval society believed you had the obligation to fit in. Your preferences didn't matter. Your uniqueness was a problem to be corrected. Religious conformity was strictest. Question church doctrine and face serious consequences. Even private doubts were dangerous because confession existed. Your faith had to be public, performative, and complete. Social conformity extended to every behaviour, how you worked, dressed, spoke. There were rules for everything and everyone enforced them. Breaking social rules meant social death. The lack of social mobility meant conformity was permanent. You couldn't move somewhere new and reinvent yourself. You were known. Your family was known. You carried that history everywhere. Shame was the primary enforcement mechanism. Do something wrong and everyone would know. They'd judge you. They'd remind you for years. Shame would follow you forever. Honour was everything for men. Your reputation, your word, your ability to protect your family. Losing honour meant losing everything. Men would fight and die over perceived slights. For women, reputation was sexual purity. Your entire value was tied to chastity before marriage and fidelity after. A reputation for promiscuity, even if undeserved, would destroy your life. Gossip could kill. Rumours could destroy lives. Accused of witchcraft based on gossip? You'd be investigated and possibly executed. Accused of theft? You'd face punishment. Accusations didn't require proof. Gossip was enough. The constant judgment would erode your sense of self. You'd internalise the community's view of you. You'd start to see yourself through their eyes. Your self-worth would be entirely external, dependent on approval. The psychological damage of living under constant surveillance would be severe. Anxiety would be constant. Depression would be common, though unnamed. You'd feel trapped because you were trapped. Trapped in your role, your class, your village, your life. You'd watch yourself disappear. The person you were, The individual with unique thoughts and feelings and desires would be crushed under the weight of conformity and judgment. You'd become what society demanded, and the you that existed before would be gone, lost forever, irrecoverable. Here's something that would destroy you in ways you haven't imagined: the utter meaninglessness of your suffering. In your modern life, suffering has context. You understand cause and effect. You know that illness is caused by pathogens, that injury results from accidents, that hardship comes from economic forces or natural disasters. You can make sense of suffering even when you can't prevent it. You have frameworks for understanding why bad things happen. Medieval people had frameworks too, but theirs were wrong. And knowing the frameworks were wrong while being unable to convince anyone else would drive you insane. When your child died, medieval people would say it was God's will, divine plan. The child was too pure for this world, so God took them early. These explanations provided comfort to people who believed them, but you'd know the truth. Your child died from a bacterial infection that could have been treated with antibiotics, or from malnutrition that could have been prevented with proper diet, or from any number of preventable causes that went untreated because nobody understood how disease worked. The pointlessness would be maddening. Every death that could have been prevented, every illness that could have been cured, every injury that could have been treated, all of it happening because knowledge that exists in your head doesn't exist in this world. You'd watch people die and know they didn't have to. You'd see suffering that served no purpose, taught no lesson, achieved nothing. Just waste. Endless, meaningless waste of human life. Prayer was the default response to everything. Sick, pray. Injured, pray. Crop failing, pray. House burning down, pray. Prayer was supposed to solve problems that required practical intervention. And when prayer didn't work, which it wouldn't, people would assume they weren't praying hard enough, or that God was punishing them for sins. The concept of divine punishment for sin explained everything bad that happened. Plague struck your village, someone angered God, your cow died, you're being punished, your baby was stillborn. God is testing you or punishing you for transgressions. This framework blamed victims for their suffering. It added guilt and shame to tragedy, and you couldn't argue against it without being called a heretic. Miracles were the explanation for anything good that happened unexpectedly. Recovered from illness? Miracle. Found food during famine? Miracle. Survived an accident? Miracle. The idea that outcomes had natural explanations was foreign. Everything was divine intervention, God's hand in every event. This removed agency from humans and made life feel like a cosmic puppet show where you had no control over anything. Astrology was taken seriously by educated people. Planetary alignments were believed to influence events on Earth. The position of stars at your birth determined your personality and fate. This was considered legitimate knowledge, not superstition. Physicians consulted astrological charts before treating patients. Battle commanders chose attack times based on planetary positions. Your modern understanding of astronomy would be worthless because nobody would believe that stars are distant suns with no influence on human affairs. Alchemy was the precursor to chemistry, but it was mixed with mystical nonsense. People believed in the philosopher's stone that could turn lead into gold. They thought they could create homunculi, tiny artificial humans. They pursued immortality through magical potions. Real chemical processes were discovered through alchemy, but they were buried in layers of mysticism that made progress incredibly slow. The four elements theory explained everything: earth, water, air, fire. Everything in existence was some combination of these four elements. This was taught as fact. Modern chemistry, with its periodic table and atomic theory, would sound like gibberish to medieval ears. You couldn't explain atoms because the concept didn't exist. You couldn't prove your understanding because you had no way to demonstrate it. Spontaneous generation was believed without question. People thought maggots spontaneously appeared from rotting meat. Mice spontaneously generated from grain. Frogs appeared from mud. The idea that living things only came from other living things wasn't yet understood. You could tell people about bacteria and reproduction, and they'd look at you like you were insane. The geocentric model of the universe was dogma enforced by the church. Earth was the center of creation. The sun, moon, planets, and stars all rotated around Earth. This made intuitive sense because that's what it looked like from Earth's surface. Suggesting that Earth orbited the sun would be heresy. Galileo wouldn't be born for centuries, and when he was, he'd be forced to recant his heliocentric views. The age of the Earth was calculated from biblical genealogies, a few thousand years old. The concept of geological time, of millions and billions of years, didn't exist. Fossils were thought to be stones that naturally grew in the shape of bones, or the remains of animals that died in Noah's flood. The idea of extinction didn't make sense because why would God create animals just to let them die out? Anatomy was poorly understood even by physicians. Dissection was sometimes banned, sometimes allowed, but always rare. Most anatomical knowledge came from ancient texts that were wrong. The heart was thought to be the seat of intelligence and emotion. The brain was less important. The function of various organs was misunderstood or completely unknown. Blood circulation wouldn't be discovered until the 17th century. Dreams were prophetic or divine messages, not random brain activity during sleep. Important decisions were sometimes made based on dream interpretation. Priests and wise women would be consulted to explain what dreams meant. The idea that dreams were just your subconscious processing information would be rejected. Demons and angels were real, physical beings that interacted with the world, not metaphors, real entities with agency and power. Demons caused misfortune, tempted people to sin, possessed bodies. Angels protected the faithful, carried messages from God, fought demons. The spiritual realm was as real as the physical realm, more real in some ways, because it explained everything that happened in the physical realm. Hell was a real place of eternal physical torture, not a metaphor for separation from God. Actual fire, actual demons with pitchforks, actual eternal suffering. The fear of hell was visceral and constant. It motivated behavior, enforced morality, terrified people into compliance. You'd be surrounded by people genuinely terrified of eternal damnation, and their fear would be contagious. Heaven was similarly literal, a physical place above the sky where God and angels lived and where the saved went after death. The descriptions were detailed. Gold streets, pearly gates, endless worship of God in paradise. People believed this completely. Their entire lives were oriented around getting into heaven and avoiding hell. Purgatory was where most people went first, a place of temporary punishment to purge sins before entering heaven. The duration in purgatory could be reduced through prayers, good works, and purchasing indulgences. This created a whole economy around death, paying priests to pray for your deceased relatives, commissioning masses, donating to the church to reduce your loved one's time in purgatory. Saints were supernatural beings who could intercede with God on your behalf. You'd pray to specific saints for specific problems. St. Christopher for safe travel, St. Anthony for lost items, St. Sebastian for protection from plague. The saints weren't just role models, they were active participants in your life, able to perform miracles if you prayed hard enough. Relics were objects with magical properties, a splinter from the true cross, a vial of saint's blood, a bone fragment from a martyr. These objects could heal, protect, grant wishes. People would travel hundreds of miles to touch a relic. Wars were fought over possession of important relics. The trade in fake relics was massive because demand far exceeded supply of real ones. Not that real meant anything when it was all superstition. Confession was mandatory. You had to confess your sins to a priest regularly. He'd assign penance, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, donation to the church. Your sins weren't private. The priest knew everything, and priests were human. They gossiped. They used information learned in confession for political purposes. Your secrets were never truly secret. Excommunication was the ultimate punishment. Being cut off from the church meant you couldn't receive sacraments, couldn't take communion, couldn't be absolved of sins. You'd go to hell when you died. This terrified people. Social pressure to avoid excommunicated people was intense. They were pariahs. sometimes starving because nobody would trade with them. Heresy was defined broadly. Any deviation from church doctrine, any questioning of church authority, any independent interpretation of Scripture, reading the Bible in your own language was heresy for much of the medieval period. The church wanted to control the message. Your literacy and ability to read original texts would make you dangerous in their eyes. Book burning was common. Books containing heretical ideas were destroyed. Libraries were purged. Knowledge was controlled. The church decided what people could read, what ideas they could be exposed to, what thoughts they could think. Censorship was total and enforced brutally. Now let's discuss something that would horrify you. The treatment of people with disabilities. Modern society, at least theoretically, believes disabled people deserve dignity, accommodation, and support. Medieval society believed disabled people were cursed, punished by God, or possessed by demons. Physical disabilities were seen as marks of sin. Born with a deformity, your parents must have sinned. Became disabled through accident or illness. God is punishing you. This added moral judgment to physical suffering. You weren't just disabled, you were being punished. You deserved your suffering. Mental disabilities were even worse. People with developmental disabilities were considered less than human. Idiots, they were called. Imbeciles. Morons. These weren't just insults. These were medical categories, and people in these categories had no rights, no protections, no value. Epilepsy was thought to be demonic possession. The falling sickness. When someone had a seizure, people would think they were being controlled by demons. Treatment was exorcism, prayer, sometimes violence to drive out the demon. The idea that epilepsy was a neurological condition was centuries away. Blindness and deafness were disabilities with no accommodation, no braille, no sign language. Blind people couldn't read. Deaf people couldn't communicate with most people. They were isolated, helpless, dependent on charity. Most didn't survive long without family support. People with disabilities couldn't work most jobs. Farming required physical ability. Crafts required fine motor control or sight or hearing. The economy had no place for people who couldn't perform physical labour, so they begged, or starved, or relied on family charity that might or might not be forthcoming. Children born with severe disabilities were sometimes left to die. Exposure was practiced in some places. Leave the baby outside to die from exposure to elements, or simply don't feed it. Let it starve. This was seen as merciful, better than raising a child who'd never be normal, never contribute, never be anything but a burden. Your modern sensibilities about disability rights would be incomprehensible. The idea that disabled people are fully human with equal rights and dignity would be revolutionary. Suggesting that society should accommodate disabilities rather than viewing them as divine punishment would mark you as dangerously radical. The casual cruelty toward vulnerable people would be everywhere. Not just disabled people, but anyone weak. The elderly, the sick, orphans, anyone who couldn't defend themselves or contribute economically. They were burdens, expendable, worthy of charity if you were feeling generous but not deserving of systematic support. Let's talk about something else that would break you. The complete lack of personal agency. You're used to making choices. Where to live, what to do for work, who to marry, whether to have children, how to spend your free time. Medieval people had almost none of these choices. Your life was predetermined by your birth and enforced by social structures you couldn't escape. Your occupation was chosen for you. You did what your father did. No aptitude testing, no career counselling, no opportunity to discover what you were good at. You had a role and you filled it. Your marriage was arranged. Your parents chose your spouse based on economic considerations, land holdings, family alliances, dowry negotiations. Love wasn't a factor. You married who you were told to marry and you made it work or you suffered. Your religion was mandatory. You were born Christian. You died Christian. Converting to another religion was illegal and punishable by death. Everyone believed in God. The only question was which version of Christianity you followed. Your social class was permanent. Born a peasant, die a peasant. The class system was rigid and divinely ordained. God placed you in your station, and questioning that placement was questioning God's plan. Your geographic location was fixed. You lived where you were born. Moving required permission from your Lord. You couldn't just pack up and try your luck in a new place. You were tied to the land legally and economically. Your diet was determined by what grew locally and what you could afford. You ate what was available. If you didn't like the food, tough. Hunger was a better option than starvation. Your clothing was determined by your class. Sumptuary laws regulated what colours and fabrics different classes could wear. You couldn't dress above your station. Doing so was illegal. The powerlessness would suffocate you. Every aspect of your life controlled by forces beyond your influence. The church controlling your beliefs. The Lord controlling your work. Your family controlling your marriage. Society controlling your behaviour. Nature controlling your survival. You had no autonomy, no self-determination, no ability to shape your own life. The modern concept of individual rights would be incomprehensible. Rights were based on your status, not your humanity. A noble had rights. A freeman had some rights. A serf had almost no rights. A slave had none. The idea that all humans have inherent rights simply by virtue of being human would sound insane. Rights came from your position in the social hierarchy, granted by those above you, not inherent to your existence. Freedom as you understand it didn't exist. Freedom wasn't the ability to make choices about your life. Freedom was a legal status that meant you weren't a slave. A free peasant was still bound to his lord's land, still required to work certain days for the lord, still needed permission to marry or move. Free meant you weren't property. It didn't mean you had liberty. Privacy, as we discussed, was non-existent. But let's emphasize the psychological impact. Never being alone. Never having space that was yours. Never having thoughts that were completely private. The constant exposure to others would erode your sense of self. You'd struggle to maintain an identity separate from your family, your village, your role in society. The future held no hope of improvement. This is perhaps the most crushing aspect of medieval life. In your modern world, even if things are bad now, you can hope they'll get better. Technology will advance. Medicine will improve. Society will progress. Medieval people had no such hope. The future would be like the past. Their children's lives would be like their lives, forever. No progress, no improvement, just endless repetition of the same difficult existence. Innovation was discouraged. New ways of doing things were suspicious. Change was dangerous. The old ways worked well enough to keep people alive, barely, and changing them risked making things worse. Better to stick with what's known. This meant progress was glacially slow. Good ideas were ignored or suppressed. Improvements that could have helped millions were dismissed because they were different. Questioning authority was unthinkable. The social hierarchy was ordained by God. The church's authority came from God. The king ruled by divine right. Lords had authority over their lands granted by the king. Masters had authority over apprentices. Husbands had authority over wives. Fathers had authority over children. This chain of authority was absolute. Questioning it was questioning God's order. The psychological toll of complete powerlessness would manifest in ways you'd struggle to articulate. Learned helplessness would set in early. You'd stop trying to change things because you'd learn that trying was pointless. You'd accept suffering as inevitable. You'd internalize the idea that you deserved your station, that this was God's plan for you, that resistance was both futile and sinful. Depression would be rampant but unrecognized. The constant grinding poverty, the lack of hope, the powerlessness, the suffering. These would create pervasive depression throughout the population. But it wouldn't be treated as illness. It would be seen as spiritual weakness or lack of faith. Pray more. Trust God. Accept your lot. These would be the prescribed remedies, and they wouldn't work. Anxiety would be universal. Constant worry about survival. Will the crops fail? Will I get sick? Will my children live? Will war come to my village? Will the Lord increase his demands? Will I starve this winter? The uncertainty of everything, combined with complete inability to control outcomes, would create crushing anxiety that you'd live with every day. Trauma would be common and unprocessed. watching people die violently, experiencing violence yourself, losing children, suffering abuse, living through war or plague or famine. These traumatic experiences would accumulate with no therapy, no support groups, no framework for processing trauma. You'd just carry it. The weight would compound over time until you were barely functional, going through the motions of life but dead inside. The survival of the human spirit under these conditions is remarkable. People found joy where they could, celebrated small victories, formed deep bonds with family and community, found meaning in religion, took pride in their work. But you, with your modern psychology and expectations, would struggle to adapt. You'd know what life could be like. You'd know what you were missing, and that knowledge would be a special kind of torture. Let's address something you haven't fully considered: the sheer physical exhaustion that would define every moment of your existence. You're tired sometimes in modern life. You have bad nights of sleep. You work long days occasionally, but you've never experienced the bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of medieval peasant life. The kind of tiredness that becomes your permanent state, that you wake up with and go to bed with and carry through every waking hour. Your body would be worked beyond its capacity every single day. 16-hour work days weren't occasional. They were normal during planting and harvest seasons. You'd wake before dawn and work until you literally couldn't see anymore. Your muscles would ache, your joints would throb, your hands would be so tired they'd shake, and you'd still have to keep working because the crops didn't care about your exhaustion. The work wasn't just long, it was physically brutal. Swinging a scythe for hours, hauling buckets of water, digging in hard soil, carrying heavy loads, bending and stooping and reaching and lifting. Every task required maximum physical effort. There were no power tools, no machines, no ways to make the work easier, just your body against the demands of survival. Rest breaks weren't scheduled. You rested when the work allowed it, which was almost never. Stop to catch your breath and you're wasting daylight. Stop to eat and you're falling behind. Keep moving, keep working. Push through the pain and exhaustion because stopping means failure, and failure means death. Sleep would never be enough. You'd go to bed exhausted and wake up still exhausted. Your body wouldn't have time to fully recover before you had to work again. The sleep debt would accumulate day after day, week after week, year after year. You'd be operating at a fraction of your capacity all the time, running on fumes, barely functional but still required to function. The physical toll would age you rapidly. 20-year-olds would look 30. 30-year-olds would look 50. By 40, you'd be used up. Your body would be breaking down from decades of overwork. Your back permanently bent, your hands gnarled, your joints destroyed. You'd shuffle when you walked, move slowly because moving hurt, and you'd still have to work because there was no retirement, no disability support, no option to stop. Women would be even more exhausted. All the work men did, plus the work of managing a household. Cooking, cleaning, making and repairing clothes, caring for children. Doing all of this while pregnant or nursing, women's work was never done, literally. There was always another task, another mouth to feed, another thing to clean, another child to tend to. The exhaustion would be relentless. Pregnancy while exhausted would be dangerous. Your body would be trying to build a baby while being worked to exhaustion. Insufficient nutrition, insufficient rest, maximum physical demands. Many pregnancy complications stem from exactly these conditions. But you wouldn't be able to rest. You'd work through pregnancy until labour started. Then you'd give birth and immediately return to work. Children wouldn't be spared. As soon as they could walk, they'd be put to work. Simple tasks at first. Gathering eggs, weeding gardens, fetching water. But they'd grow into harder work quickly. By age 10, they'd be doing adult labour. Their bodies would be pushed beyond what's healthy for developing children. Their growth would be stunted. Their potential would be limited by early exhaustion and malnutrition. The elderly would be exhausted and used up. By the time you reached old age, assuming you reached old age, your body would be completely destroyed. You'd have nothing left to give, and you'd feel guilty about it. Guilty for being a burden. Guilty for consuming resources without producing. The social pressure on the elderly to just die and stop being a drain on the family was intense. Modern, you can't comprehend this level of exhaustion, because you've never experienced it. Your tired is a different category than medieval tired. Your tired is an inconvenience. Medieval tired was a life-threatening condition that you lived with constantly. Your tired goes away after a good night's sleep. Medieval tired never went away. The psychological effects of chronic exhaustion would be severe. Exhaustion impairs judgment, reduces impulse control, increases irritability, decreases emotional regulation. You'd make poor decisions because your brain was too tired to think clearly. You'd snap at loved ones because you had no patience left. You'd feel hopeless because exhaustion made everything seem impossible. The lack of leisure would mean the exhaustion had no relief. Modern exhaustion is balanced by rest, relaxation, entertainment. Medieval exhaustion was constant because work was constant. The brief moments that weren't work were spent eating or sleeping or doing necessary maintenance on your body and possessions. There was no recovery time, no vacation days, no weekends, just work until you collapsed and then work some more. Now let's talk about something that would horrify you. The treatment of children. You probably believe children deserve protection, nurture, education, and a childhood free from adult responsibilities. Medieval children got none of this. Childhood as a protected period of development didn't exist. Children were small adults who needed to contribute economically as soon as possible. Infant mortality has been mentioned, but let's really absorb what it means. 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday. 1 in 2 died before age 5. Parents expected to lose children. They had more children than they wanted, knowing some wouldn't survive. This created a strange emotional distance. You couldn't fully attach to infants because they probably wouldn't make it. The grief when they died was real, but it was also expected, normalised, something everyone went through. Children who survived infancy weren't coddled. They were workers in training. By age 5 or 6, they had chores, real work that contributed to household survival, not playing at work, actual labour that mattered. If they didn't do it, the family suffered. The pressure on small children to perform adult tasks was immense. Education didn't exist for most children. Learning happened through apprenticeship and observation. You watched your parents work and you copied them. You made mistakes and were punished. You learned by doing. Books, formal schooling, teachers, none of this was available. Most children would grow up completely illiterate, unable to even sign their own names. Discipline was physical and brutal. Children were beaten for misbehaviour, not spanked, beaten. With hands, sticks, belts, whatever was available. The beatings were hard enough to leave bruises, draw blood, cause injuries. This was considered good parenting. Spare the rod, spoil the child. The Bible said to beat your children, and everyone did. Child labour was universal and exploitative. Children worked in fields, in workshops, in homes. They worked the same hours as adults. They did dangerous tasks. They were exposed to all the same hazards as adult workers. Getting injured or killed doing adult work was common. Nobody was outraged. It was just life. Apprenticeships could be abusive. A child apprenticed to a craftsman would live with the master. The master had total authority. He could work the apprentice as hard as he wanted, beat them as much as he wanted, feed them as little as he wanted. Some apprenticeships were good. Many were exploitative. The apprentice had no recourse. They were bound to the master for years. Children of the poor suffered most. They'd be sent away to work for other families, essentially rented out as cheap labour. They'd leave their families young, sometimes at age 7 or 8, to work as servants or farmhands for strangers. The separation was permanent in many cases. They'd send their earnings back to their families. They'd rarely see their parents or siblings again. Orphans had the worst fate. With no parents to protect them, they were completely vulnerable. Orphanages existed in some places, but they were grim. Overcrowded, understaffed, disease-ridden. Many orphans just lived on streets, begging, stealing, dying young from starvation or exposure or violence. The mortality rate for orphans was astronomical. The complete absence of child protection would shock you. Children had no rights. They were property of their parents. Parents could do basically whatever they wanted to their children short of killing them outright, and even then, prosecution was rare. The idea that children deserve special protection That childhood is a valuable developmental period, that kids shouldn't be working 16-hour days. All of this was centuries in the future. Your modern understanding of child development would make watching medieval childhood unbearable. You'd know that these children were being traumatized, stunted, damaged in ways that would affect them forever. You'd know that the brutality wasn't making them better adults. You'd know that education and play and protection would serve them better than labour and beatings. And you couldn't do anything about it. The guilt would eat at you if you had children. You'd have to beat them because not beating them would be seen as neglect. You'd have to put them to work because your family needed their labour. You'd have to watch them suffer and know you were contributing to that suffering. You'd be trapped between your modern understanding of child welfare and medieval necessities. Losing a child would destroy you even though it was common. Every parent lost children. Everyone understood the grief. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. You'd bury a child and know that modern medicine could have saved them. You'd watch your baby die from diarrhea that Pedialyte would have cured. You'd see your toddler succumb to an infection that antibiotics would have cleared up. The preventability of it all would make the grief unbearable. Now let's discuss something that would break you emotionally: the constant presence of death. In your modern life, death is largely hidden. People die in hospitals, bodies are handled by professionals, funerals are brief and tasteful. You can live years without witnessing death directly. Medieval people lived surrounded by death. It was constant, visible, and unavoidable. You'd see people die regularly: neighbours from disease, relatives from accidents, strangers in the street, public executions, animals being slaughtered. Death was everywhere. The sight of corpses would be routine. The smell of decay would be familiar. You'd become desensitized because you had no choice. Bodies weren't hidden away. The dead were laid out in homes, washed by family members, viewed by the community, buried quickly because there was no embalming and bodies decomposed fast. You'd participate in these rituals, touch dead bodies, help bury them. There was no avoiding it. Child death was especially common and especially traumatic. You'd attend funerals for children constantly. Your children, your neighbours' children, children in your village. Tiny coffins would be a regular sight. The grief would be communal and ongoing. There was no moving past it because it kept happening. Mass death from plague or famine would be worse. Watching your village population drop by 30 or 50%. Multiple people dying every day. Bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves. The complete breakdown of normal death rituals because there were too many dead. The psychological trauma would be catastrophic. Your own death would loom constantly. Life expectancy was short. Disease was common. Accidents were frequent. You could die any day. This awareness would create existential dread that you'd carry always. Every cough could be the start of the illness that kills you. Every injury could get infected and turn fatal. Death wasn't an abstract future event. It was an immediate possibility. The fear of damnation would make death worse. You believed in hell. You believed that dying with unconfessed sins meant eternal torture. This made death terrifying in ways beyond the physical. You'd fear for your soul. You'd obsess about whether you'd make it to heaven. The spiritual terror would compound the physical fear. Deathbed scenes were intense. The dying person would be surrounded by family, priests, community members. Last rites would be administered. Death was a public event, witnessed by everyone. Grief had no privacy. Mourning was public and performative. You'd be expected to wail to demonstrate your grief visibly. Quiet mourning was suspicious. Your grief had to be visible to the community. The dead haunted the living literally in medieval belief. Ghosts were real. Spirits of the dead who hadn't passed on properly would return. The boundary between living and dead was permeable. The dead could reach back, and that terrified people. Memento mori was a constant theme. Remember that you will die. Art depicted death. Sermons preached about death. The inevitability of death was emphasized constantly. This wasn't morbid fascination. This was practical reminder that you could die any moment and needed to keep your soul ready. The psychological impact of constant death awareness would be profound. Now let's wrap up with the ultimate truth about why you wouldn't survive. It's not just the physical hardships, though those would kill most modern people. It's not just the disease or the violence or the hunger, though any of those could end you. It's the complete psychological incompatibility between who you are and what medieval life requires. You've been shaped by modernity in ways you don't even recognize. Your expectations about life, your understanding of your own worth, your belief in human rights and dignity and progress. These aren't natural. These are products of centuries of social evolution that medieval people didn't have. You can't unlearn what you know. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you understand about how the world actually works. Medieval people survived because they didn't know any different. This was life. This was normal. They had no framework for imagining anything better. Their suffering had meaning because they believed God intended it. Their hard work had purpose because they believed it would be rewarded in heaven. Their powerlessness was acceptable because they believed the social hierarchy was divinely ordained. You know different. You know life doesn't have to be this brutal. You know, children don't have to die from preventable diseases. You know, people aren't inherently superior because of their birth class. You know, the earth orbits the sun, and prayer doesn't cure infections, and social systems are human constructions that can be changed. This knowledge would make medieval life unbearable. The cognitive dissonance would drive you insane. Watching preventable suffering and being unable to prevent it. Knowing better treatments and being unable to administer them. Seeing injustice and being unable to fight it. Understanding that everything around you is based on wrong information and wrong assumptions and wrong beliefs, and being completely powerless to correct any of it. You'd be alone in your knowledge. Nobody would understand you. Nobody would believe you. Your attempts to help would be rejected or punished. You'd be forced to participate in systems you knew were wrong. The isolation would be total, being surrounded by people who might as well be aliens because their worldview is so different. Having no one who shares your values or understands your perspective. You'd watch yourself change. Watch the modern you disappear. You'd have to beat your children even though you know it's wrong. You'd have to accept injustice even though you know it's unjust. And with each compromise, you'd lose more of who you were. The death of hope would be the final blow. Hope for improvement. Hope for change. Hope for something better. Medieval people had hope for heaven, but no hope for earth. You wouldn't have even that. You'd know heaven isn't real. You'd know there's no cosmic justice waiting. You'd know that this suffering is pointless, and the only meaning is what humans create. And medieval humans created a system that grinds people into dust for no reason. So when we ask if you could survive in medieval times, we're not really asking if your body could survive the physical challenges. We're asking if you as a person, as a modern human with modern understanding and modern expectations, could survive having all of that stripped away. Could you survive becoming someone you'd despise? Could you survive losing everything that makes life meaningful to you? Could you survive watching your children suffer and die knowing it didn't have to be this way? The answer is no. You couldn't. Not as you. The you that survives medieval times, if any version of you survives, wouldn't be you anymore. It would be a medieval peasant who happens to have some strange memories of a different world. A broken person going through the motions of survival. All the light gone from their eyes. All the hope crushed out of their soul. And maybe, in your worst moments, as you lay on your straw pallet covered in lice, bones aching, stomach growling, listening to your child cough in the darkness and knowing there's nothing you can do, maybe then you'd understand what medieval people knew. This is hell, not the afterlife. Right here, this existence is hell, and there's no escape except death. But even that knowledge wouldn't save you. You'd still wake up tomorrow and do it all again. Because that's what survival requires. Keep going even when everything hurts. Keep living even when life has become nothing but pain and exhaustion and fear. That's why you wouldn't survive in medieval times. Not because you're weak, but because you're not broken enough. Medieval life required you to be broken in specific ways, to accept specific suffering, to believe specific lies about why the suffering was necessary. You can't force yourself to be broken that way, so you'd break differently, in ways that medieval people didn't because they had coping mechanisms you lack. Faith that meant something, community that provided support. You'd have knowledge without power, understanding without ability to act, and that combination would destroy you more surely than any disease or famine ever could. There's one more thing we need to address, something that would break you in ways we haven't fully explored: the complete absence of beauty in your life. You're used to beauty being accessible, music at the touch of a button, art in museums and on screens, literature in libraries and online, natural beauty you can visit whenever you want, architecture designed to inspire, spaces created for aesthetic pleasure. Medieval peasant life had almost none of this. Beauty was a luxury you couldn't afford. Your world would be relentlessly ugly. Your home was a dark, smoky, cramped room with dirt floors and minimal furnishings. Your clothing was rough, stained, patched wool in dull browns and greys. Your tools were crude and functional. Your food was brown and beige mush. Everything around you would be worn, dirty and utilitarian. The church was the only source of intentional beauty for most people. Stained glass windows that turned sunlight into coloured light, paintings and sculptures of religious scenes, ornate decorations, soaring architecture. The church used beauty deliberately to inspire awe and demonstrate God's glory. It worked. For people whose daily lives were relentlessly drab, walking into a decorated church was transcendent. But you'd only experience that beauty during mandatory church services. You couldn't just visit to appreciate the art. You couldn't study the architecture. You'd sit through Latin services you didn't understand, standing on cold stone floors, your back aching, while beautiful things existed around you but weren't really for you. They were for God. You were just permitted to be in their presence while you worshipped. Nature provided some beauty. Sunsets, stars, flowers in spring, trees in autumn. But you'd rarely have time to appreciate these things. You'd be too busy working, too exhausted to notice, too focused on survival to care about aesthetics. The sunset was just a signal that the workday was ending. The flowers meant it was planting season. Beauty was incidental, not the point. Music existed, but it was limited. Folk songs passed down orally. Work songs to maintain rhythm during labour. Religious hymns. No musical notation for most people, so everything was memorised. No recordings, so if you wanted to hear music, someone had to perform it live. And most people's singing voices were probably terrible because nobody had training. Musical instruments were rare and expensive. If you were lucky, someone in your village might have a simple pipe or drum. Wealthy people had lutes and harps. Professional minstrels travelled between courts performing for nobles. But for common people, music was mostly unaccompanied singing. And the songs were repetitive because complexity was hard to maintain through oral tradition. Stories provided mental beauty. Tales of heroic deeds, romances, moral lessons. Listening to a good storyteller was entertainment and education combined. But the stories were limited to what could be remembered and transmitted orally. No books to read, no new stories being written and distributed widely. The same tales told over and over with variations. Visual art beyond churches was nearly non-existent in peasant life. No paintings on your walls, no sculptures in your home, no decorative objects. Everything you owned was functional. A pot for cooking, a knife for cutting, a spoon for eating. Aesthetic consideration wasn't part of object design. Things were made to work, not to look good. Colour was rare. Natural dyes produced muted shades. Bright colours were expensive, requiring rare dyes or complex processes. Nobles wore vibrant reds, purples, blues. You wore browns, greys, undyed wool. Your world was literally less colourful than theirs. The visual monotony would be oppressive. Your environment would assault your senses in unpleasant ways constantly. The smell of human and animal waste, the sound of people coughing and children crying, the sight of decay and filth, the taste of bland food, the feel of itchy fabric and biting insects. Beauty would be drowned out by ugliness. The psychological impact of living without beauty would be severe. Humans need aesthetic experience. We need things that inspire, that uplift, that remind us there's more to life than survival. Beauty provides hope. It demonstrates that creation can be more than functional. Medieval peasants got tiny doses of beauty through church and nature. You'd recognise how insufficient that was. You'd hunger for beauty you couldn't have. You'd remember concerts, museums, movies, books. You'd remember colour and variety and artistic expression, and you'd know it all existed somewhere in the world, in the courts of nobles, in the churches of cities, but it was locked away from you. The frustration would be constant. Let's talk about one final thing that would make your life unbearable, the complete lack of privacy for bodily functions we touched on, but let's really examine what this means for dignity. You believe humans deserve dignity, privacy, respect for their bodies, and bodily functions. Medieval life offered none of this. Using the toilet was semi-public at best. Your chamber pot was in the corner of your one-room dwelling. Everyone heard you. Everyone smelled you. There was no pretending bodily functions didn't happen. No polite fiction that waste disposal was private and hygienic. It was right there, constant, unavoidable. Bathing was infrequent, and when it happened, it was often semi-public. Public bathhouses existed in some places. You'd strip naked with strangers and wash in shared water. Privacy wasn't expected. Modesty about your naked body wasn't practical. Everyone saw everyone else naked. Bodies were just bodies. Sexual activity in a one-room dwelling with your entire family present was unavoidable. You'd try to be quiet. You'd try to be discreet. But everyone knew what was happening. Children would grow up hearing their parents have sex. Parents would know when their adult children were having sex. Privacy didn't exist. Illness meant your symptoms were public. Vomiting, diarrhea, fever sweats, all happening in front of your family. No bathroom to retreat to. No privacy to be sick in peace. Everyone witnessed your suffering and your body's most undignified moments. Childbirth was witnessed by multiple people, not just medical professionals, family members, neighbours, sometimes a crowd. Your most vulnerable moment, your body doing the most intense thing it can do, and you'd have an audience. The pain and indignity would be compounded by the lack of privacy. Death and dying was equally public. You'd die in your one-room home surrounded by people. They'd watch you deteriorate, watch you lose control of your body, watch you suffer. There was no dying with dignity, just dying while everyone watched. Your body would never be truly yours. It would always be subject to public view, public judgment, public commentary. Too fat, too thin, scarred, deformed. Everyone would see and everyone would have opinions. You couldn't hide physical imperfections. You couldn't control who saw your body in what states. The modern concept of bodily autonomy would be foreign. Your body belonged to your lord in that he controlled what labour you did. It belonged to your husband if you were a woman. It belonged to the church in that they regulated what you could and couldn't do with it. The idea that you had sovereignty over your own body would be revolutionary. The loss of dignity would be cumulative and crushing. Every day, multiple times a day, you'd experience situations that violated what you believed to be basic human dignity. You'd be forced to accept it because there was no alternative, but accepting it wouldn't make it hurt less. You'd feel the violation every time, even as you went through the motions. Now let's bring this all together. We've covered the physical hardships, the disease, the violence, the hunger, the exhaustion, the lack of knowledge, the absence of freedom, the omnipresence of death, the treatment of children, the oppression of women, the psychological trauma, the loss of beauty and dignity. Each of these individually would be difficult. Together, they'd be impossible. But there's one more layer we need to acknowledge: the sheer randomness of suffering. In your modern life, suffering often has causes you can understand and sometimes address. You get sick because you were exposed to a pathogen. You lose your job because of economic factors. You experience trauma because of specific events. There's cause and effect. There's logic even in tragedy. Medieval suffering was often random. Why did one child survive plague while another died? Nobody knew. Why did one field produce good harvest while the neighbouring field failed? Random variation in soil and weather nobody understood. Why did one woman survive childbirth while another hemorrhaged to death? Luck, chance, the unknowable will of God. This randomness would be maddening. You'd see good people suffer and bad people prosper. You'd watch someone who did everything right lose everything to factors beyond their control. You'd see injustice with no explanation beyond God's will or bad luck. The unfairness would be everywhere, and there'd be no justice, no balance, no cosmic order that made sense. Your attempts to find patterns would fail. You'd try to identify what caused illness or crop failure or death. But without scientific method, without controlled experiments, without data collection, you'd see false patterns everywhere. Correlation would look like causation. Coincidence would seem meaningful. You'd develop superstitions trying to control the uncontrollable. The powerlessness in the face of randomness would break you. You could do everything right and still lose everything. You could make all the correct choices and still watch your children die. You could work yourself to death and still starve. Effort didn't guarantee results. Virtue didn't guarantee reward. Existence was a lottery where most people drew losing numbers. Medieval religion tried to address this. Everything happened for a reason, even if humans couldn't understand God's plan. Suffering built character. Hardship tested faith. Reward came in the afterlife, not this life. These explanations provided comfort to believers. But you'd know they were just stories people told themselves to cope with random suffering. You wouldn't have that comfort. The absence of control over your own fate would be absolute. You couldn't prevent disease through hygiene because germ theory didn't exist. You couldn't ensure good harvests through scientific agriculture because agricultural science didn't exist. You couldn't protect your children through modern medicine because medicine was primitive and wrong. Everything that mattered was subject to forces you couldn't understand or influence. You'd develop learned helplessness. Why try? Trying didn't help. Why plan? Plans meant nothing when plague or famine or war could destroy everything tomorrow. Why hope? Hope just made disappointment hurt more. You'd go through the motions of living because humans do, because survival instinct is strong. But you wouldn't believe any of it mattered. The meaninglessness would be the final straw. Modern people can find meaning even in suffering. Meaning through relationships, through work, through contribution to something larger, through personal growth, through creative expression. Medieval peasants found meaning through religion and community. But you, knowing what you know, believing what you believe, would struggle to find meaning in pointless suffering that served no purpose and taught no lessons. You'd exist in a state of existential despair, aware that life could be different but unable to make it different, knowing that suffering was preventable but unable to prevent it, understanding that the systems causing the suffering were human-made and changeable, but living in a time when nobody believes systems could or should change. This is why the answer is definitively no. You would not survive in medieval times, not intact, not as yourself, not in any meaningful sense of the word survive. Your body might persist for a while, worn down and used up and destroyed by labour and disease and malnutrition. But you, the person you are, would die almost immediately, killed by the cognitive dissonance of knowing better in a world that didn't, killed by the moral injury of being forced to participate in systems you knew were wrong, killed by the isolation of being the only person who understood how things could be different. And in the end, as you lay dying too young from something preventable, surrounded by grieving people who'd tell themselves it was God's will, you'd know the truth. This didn't have to happen. None of it had to happen. All of this suffering, all this waste of human potential, all this pain and death and misery was unnecessary. Humans in the future would live longer, healthier, freer lives, but that knowledge wouldn't save you. It would just make your death that much more bitter. That's the final answer to why you wouldn't survive in medieval times. Because you'd know, and knowing, in a world built on not knowing, would kill you faster than any plague ever could. When you began this thought experiment, you probably imagined yourself as an adventurer, travelling back in time with modern knowledge, ready to share wisdom, improve lives. That fantasy is seductive, the idea that you could use what you know to thrive in the past. But the reality would be nothing like the fantasy. Your knowledge would be useless, worse than useless. It would be a burden. You'd know how to prevent cholera by boiling water, but you couldn't explain germ theory in a way anyone would believe. You'd know that bloodletting was harmful, but you couldn't stop physicians from doing it. Your attempts to share knowledge would fail. Try to explain electricity and people would think you were describing magic. Try to explain evolution and you'd be executed for heresy. Try to explain basic hygiene and people would dismiss you as irrational. The gap between what you know and what medieval people could comprehend would be unbridgeable. Even simple improvements you could theoretically implement would fail. Try to introduce crop rotation using nitrogen-fixing plants. You'd need to explain soil chemistry, which requires explaining atoms, which nobody would believe. Try to improve sanitation. You'd need to convince an entire community to change behaviours that had worked for generations. The social barriers would be insurmountable. You're a peasant. Nobody listens to peasants. Your ideas would be dismissed because of who you are. The social hierarchy was rigid. It kept people in their places. Your place was working, not thinking. Gender would make it worse if you're a woman. Women's knowledge was dismissed automatically. A woman claiming to understand medicine or agriculture would be suspected of witchcraft. Your intelligence would be threatening. Your assertiveness would be inappropriate. You'd learn to keep quiet, to suppress what you know, to watch people make terrible decisions and say nothing. Because speaking up didn't help. You'd internalize the lesson that knowledge without power is torture. You'd wish you could forget, but you can't unlearn knowledge. The loneliness would intensify over time. At first, you'd try to connect with people, but every conversation would remind you of the gulf between you and everyone else. You couldn't relate to their reality because you knew it wasn't real. You'd stop trying eventually. You'd go through the motions of social interaction while remaining fundamentally isolated. Smile and nod when people said things you knew were wrong. The performance would be exhausting. Your relationships would be shallow. You couldn't be honest about what you thought or believed. You'd be playing a role constantly. The medieval peasant you pretended to be. Marriage would be especially hollow, arranged to someone you didn't choose. You'd share a bed, but not your thoughts. The intimacy would be physical only. Parenthood would be heartbreaking. You'd watch your children absorb medieval beliefs and become medieval people. They'd grow up believing in demons and divine right, and you'd have to act like you believed it too. You'd age prematurely from the stress, physical stress from labour, but also psychological stress from constant cognitive dissonance, from watching preventable suffering, from the isolation and hopelessness. By 40, if you lived that long, you'd be used up, body destroyed, mind dimmed by years of suppressing your thoughts, spirit crushed by powerlessness. You'd shuffle through remaining years waiting to die, and when you died, it would be a relief, finally escaping medieval existence, finally done with the performance. Death would be the only freedom available. Your death would mean nothing. You'd be buried in an unmarked grave. No legacy. The knowledge you carried would die with you. Another peasant who lived and died in obscurity. This is the truth about time travel fantasies. They imagine you'd maintain your identity while adapting to the past. But you wouldn't. The person you are requires modernity to exist. Your values, your understanding, your sense of self, all products of the world you come from. Medieval times wouldn't just kill your body, it would kill who you are. Your personality crushed under conformity, your intelligence wasted on survival, your compassion exhausted by constant suffering, your hope dead when change proved impossible. What would survive wouldn't be you. It would be a shell, a traumatized, broken version of a person who once had potential. So no, you wouldn't survive in medieval times. Your body might last a few years. But the you that makes you who you are, that would die almost immediately. And maybe that's the important takeaway from this thought experiment. Modernity, for all its flaws, is precious. The knowledge we have, the freedom we enjoy, the medical care that keeps us alive, the technology that connects us. None of it is guaranteed. All of it was built over centuries by people fighting against ignorance and oppression that defined medieval life. We live in a world where you can drink water without fear, where children survive, where pain can be managed, where information is available, where human rights are recognized. This didn't happen by accident. But one truth endures. You would not survive in medieval times because you are a product of your own time, shaped by advantages you rarely see. Strip those away, and what remains is utterly unprepared for the brutality of a world that predates mercy. So here we are at the end. We started with you, sitting comfortably with your central heating and antibiotics and unearned confidence. We've walked through every aspect of why medieval times would destroy you. The water that would poison you, the cold that would never leave your bones, the food that would slowly starve you even as you ate. the diseases that would ravage your unprepared immune system, the violence that would traumatize you, the work that would break your body, the powerlessness that would crush your spirit. We've examined the things you haven't thought about, the parasites that would colonize your body, the dental pain that would never end, the pregnancies that would kill you or destroy your body, the children you'd lose, the dignity you'd sacrifice, the beauty you'd never experience, the knowledge you'd have to suppress, the person you'd have to stop being, and now you know. You know with absolute certainty that you would not survive. Not really. Not in any meaningful way. The fantasy of thriving in the past is exactly that. A fantasy. A comfortable story we tell ourselves from the safety of modernity. But the reality would be brutal, unforgiving, and ultimately fatal to everything that makes you who you are. The medieval world wasn't romantic. It wasn't simpler or more authentic or more connected to nature. It was a grinding horror that consumed human lives with casual indifference. People survived it because they had no choice and no framework for imagining anything better. But you'd have both. The choice would be taken from you. But you'd always know things could be different, and that knowledge would be its own special torture. Think about what we've covered. Every single basic necessity you take for granted would become a daily struggle with potentially fatal consequences. Water, food, shelter, warmth, safety, health, privacy, dignity, freedom, hope. None of these are guaranteed in medieval times. All of them require constant effort just to maintain at subsistence levels, and despite your best efforts, you'd fail. Everyone failed eventually. Death came for everyone. The only question was when and how. The psychological damage would be the worst part. You could maybe adapt to physical hardship. Humans are remarkably resilient when survival demands it. But you can't adapt to knowing better in a world that doesn't. You can't unsee the truth. You can't unknow what makes suffering preventable. You can't reconcile modern understanding with medieval reality. The cognitive dissonance would destroy you from the inside. Every day would be a lesson in helplessness. Watch people die from things you know are curable. Watch children suffer from conditions you know are preventable. Watch injustice perpetuated by systems you know are arbitrary and changeable. Watch superstition triumph over reason. Watch cruelty masquerade as necessity. And know that you can't stop any of it. Can't change any of it. Can't even speak against it without making things worse for yourself. The isolation would compound the suffering. Surrounded by people but completely alone in your understanding. Unable to connect authentically because connection requires honesty, and honesty would mark you as dangerous. Forced to perform a version of yourself that believes what everyone believes, values what everyone values, accepts what everyone accepts. The real you would die from lack of expression. Your relationships would be hollow. Your work would be meaningless. Your suffering would serve no purpose. Your death would teach no lessons. You'd live and die as millions did. Crushed by a system that ground human potential into dust for no reason beyond, this is how things are. And perhaps that's the cruelest part. Medieval suffering wasn't necessary. It wasn't inevitable. It was the result of ignorance and social systems that prioritized control over welfare. Every person who died from infection could have been saved with antibiotics. Every woman who died in childbirth could have been saved with modern obstetrics. Every preventable death was a waste. You'd carry that knowledge like a heavy weight. All these people didn't have to suffer. Somewhere in the future, humans would figure out how to prevent most of it. But that wouldn't help you. You'd be trapped in an era of unnecessary suffering, unable to prevent it, slowly being destroyed by it yourself. This is why the question, could you survive in medieval times, misses the point. Of course, your body might survive for a while. Some bodies did. But survival isn't just about your body lasting. It's about remaining yourself, maintaining your identity, keeping the core of who you are intact. And that's impossible. Medieval times would kill you. Not just your physical body, though, it would do that too eventually. It would kill your spirit, your hope, your sense of self, your connection to the person you were. You'd become someone else. Someone broken and resigned and fundamentally different, and you'd know it was happening. You'd watch yourself disappear and be powerless to stop it. So when you're lying in bed tonight in your climate-controlled home, water running from taps, electricity powering lights, refrigerator preserving food, medicine in the cabinet, information at your fingertips, remember this. Remember that everything you have is precious. Everything you take for granted was earned through centuries of human effort and progress. Everything that makes your life livable would be absent in medieval times. And remember that you wouldn't survive. Not because you're weak, not because you lack knowledge or skill or determination, but because you're fundamentally incompatible with a world that brutal, that ignorant, that indifferent to human suffering. You're a product of modernity, shaped by it, dependent on it in ways you don't fully recognize until it's gone. Medieval times would take everything from you: your health, your freedom, your dignity, your loved ones, your hope, yourself. And in the end, it would take your life too. Just another peasant who worked hard and suffered constantly and died young from something preventable. Forgotten, unremarkable. One more casualty of an age that devoured humans with mechanical efficiency. That unglamorous lump of iron we started with, it built the medieval world, swords and cathedrals, ploughs and prison bars, tools of creation and destruction. But iron, for all its usefulness, couldn't protect medieval people from the fundamental brutality of their existence, couldn't save them from disease or starvation or violence or ignorance, couldn't make their lives anything but hard. You wouldn't survive in medieval times, and now you know exactly why. Not because of any single thing, but because of everything. The accumulated weight of 1,000 hardships, the relentless grind of existence without modern advantages, the psychological impossibility of living with knowledge that has no power. Sleep well tonight, in your comfortable bed, in your safe home, in your precious modern world, and be grateful. Be so grateful, because medieval times would have eaten you alive, and there's nothing romantic about that at all. The truth is simple and brutal. You're here now, in this moment, because countless generations endured what you could not. They suffered so their children might suffer slightly less. They died so their descendants might live slightly longer. They persisted through conditions that would break you in days. But their persistence wasn't truly heroic. It was necessity. They had no choice but to endure, no alternative but to continue, no hope for escape except death. And you, dropped into their world with your modern mind and modern expectations and modern understanding, wouldn't even have their coping mechanisms, their faith, their acceptance, their resignation to fate. You'd have knowledge instead. Terrible, useless knowledge, and it would kill you faster than any plague ever could.